Countdown by Becker, S.J. Chapter 1 25 The morning after the big rain, Ned Bartley found the hole under the fence, crawled through it, and visited the spaceship. The fence was not old. He remembered quite clearly the day when he first saw it 10 months before. It was a hot, threatening day in late July, brooding and strange, not like other days. The sky was an odd coppery blue, not soft, but somehow metallic and harsh. There were queer sulphurous clouds which hung broodingly over the world, heavy and menacing. "It looks," Walter Drew said, as they started to drive back to Hillstown from Amarillo that day, "like it's fixin' to rain green ink." Walter was a classmate of Ned's, a stocky, friendly boy whose right leg was in a brace due to a bout with polio a couple of years previously. Ned said nothing. He felt tense and uneasy with an unfamiliar sense of impending disaster. Mike Pewkin, at the wheel of the car, had his face set in the controlled, expressionless look he wore whenever he was worried about something. Mike was in his late 20s. He was the math teacher and athletic director of Hillstown High, where Ned and Walt were students. The three had spent the day in Amarillo and had started the return drive at about 4, because Ned had faithfully promised to be home before dark so his Aunt Deborah wouldn't worry. They were driving along Route 87, which carried them over the Canadian River and north toward Dumas, where they would turn west toward Mustang Creek and home. It wasn't a long drive, as drives go in Texas, about 50 miles, and the car, which belonged to Mike, was purring smoothly along. They should be home a little after 5. It was a good road, smooth and level. At Dumas it turned toward the setting sun and stretched straight and level for 18 miles between the flat, cultivated fields that reached the horizon on both sides. Then it curved slowly and climbed gently north in a big, rising sweep, miles long, that brought it to the rolling hills which gave their name to the town they surrounded. It wriggled uncomfortably for a short distance, skirted Hillstown, flirted a few miles with the Mustang, swerved toward Dalhart, nodded in the direction of Davis, and headed straight for Colorado. They were on the straightway west of Dumas, tolling along when tires screeched. The car swerved and slowed, coming to a stop on the shoulder of the road. "Look at that!" Mike's voice was awed. The three of them piled out to get a better look at the astonishing sight. The machines were enormous, bigger than any of the gigantic red combines they were accustomed to see rolling over the cultivated lands, reaping the rich harvest of the vast Texas fields. These were monsters, a procession of them, coming toward them at a majestic, unhurried pace across the flat farmland where the maize plants lifted their heavy heads from the dry ground. Ned looked around. As far as he could see, in all directions, there was not another moving thing. The world was suddenly a great empty desert, except for the three of them standing on the road beside their car, and the procession of monstrous machines heading toward them across the field under the sulphurous light of the strange and menacing skies. They watched, fascinated. The great machines moved not on wheels, but on huge, balloon-like rollers that looked like monstrous sausages. "Rolligans," Ned heard Mike's odd whisper. "I never thought I'd see one. What do you know?" Rolligans. Ned remembered reading about them in a magazine. Huge airbags that rolled smoothly over everything in their way and so needed no roads. He had never thought to see one either. And now here they were, a whole train of them, enormous, bright green, with the letters BEST painted in dazzling white on their tall sides. The first machine sank great steel teeth into the earth and chewed out a deep, narrow trench, piling the dirt neatly on either side. The second machine straddled the ditch and unrolled into it a wide, heavy ribbon of metal, which gleamed in the strange light and reminded Ned incongruously of toothpaste flowing smoothly out of a tube. The third machine followed closely, setting into the metal ribbon poles 15 feet high, which divided at the top to form a Y, filling the strange furrow and tamping it down, so that there remained only the erect metal Ys rising rigidly at perfect regular intervals from the smooth earth. A fourth machine, taller than a house, followed along. From it there emerged a closely woven metal mesh, which somehow clamped onto the poles as it unrolled. At the rear, on either side of the newly risen fence, came 2 spidery platforms, on each of which 2 brawny young men, stripped to their waists, their backs and arms gleaming with perspiration in the strange light, spun a web of barbed wire along the 2 arms of the Y. In back of these rolled vast trailer platforms piled high with supplies, rolls of barbed wire, rolls of mesh and metal ribbons, mountains of metal poles. At a steady, unhurried pace the machines came toward the road from the northeast, leaving in their wake a wire wall crowned with metal thorns, which stretched out in a perfectly straight line across the field and disappeared over the horizon. 20 yards or so from the edge of the road the first monster came to a halt, and the diesel that powered it died in a cloud of grey smoke. The others stopped behind it. A man climbed down from the cab. He was a youthful, blond giant, bare-chested, his skin burned to a rich brown, his eyebrows bleached almost white against his tan, his hair a closely cropped mass of small, tight, straw-colored curls. He looked at the 3 figures on the road for a moment without curiosity, without interest, and then moved in long athletic strides toward the spidery platform where the barbed wire topping was spun. The young men leaned down, and he shouted something at them. One of them nodded and waved his hand toward the northwest. Ned looked in that direction and noticed for the first time a line of small red banners extending across the field. "The gate goes here," Ned heard the blond giant shout. Then the young man was back in his cabin. The world shook to the roar of his reviving diesel, and the great machine lumbered ahead, turning with astonishing ease, and heading away from the road at an angle along the line of waving red banners. The 3 watchers stood there in awed silence as the other machines followed. As the last machine passed them, one of the tall men on it waved at them, and his brown face split for an instant into a dazzling white grin. "Beats digging post holes!" His shout rose above the roar of the engines. With that same deliberate, majestic speed, the train of enormous vehicles on their great, swollen looking rollers moved away, leaving the wire wall to mark their progress. It was only after the last one had passed that Ned realized that the long, straight line of waving red banners pointed like an arrow to Hillstown, which he would reach at the end of the slow, long curve of the road. "Golly!" Walter's voice was awed. "What do you suppose that is?" "Fence." When excited, Mike Buichan always spoke in short, clipped sentences. "And we'd better be getting out of here. There's a big green truck heading this way along the road. Bet they're bringing the gate that big guy was talking about." They climbed back into the car. Walter sat in back because he was wearing his brace and needed room to keep his legs stretched out. He leaned forward and tapped Ned on the shoulder. "Hey, Brain," he said. "Ever see anything like that in New York?" "Never saw anything that big even in Texas." Ned grinned. Then he added, suddenly serious, "What do you suppose 'best' is?" "Don't know," Mike replied, and there was a touch of grimness in his voice. "But whatever it is, it's big. And it's headed straight for Hillstown. Something tells me we'll hear more about it." Mike drove along in silence for a while. Then in a soft, barely audible voice he said, "Bet there's trouble. Big trouble." He sounded, Ned thought, with a thrill of foreboding, like a prophet. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. 24. Best came into Ned's life again the next morning unexpectedly. He was sitting quietly in his room, reading, when the phone rang and he heard his Uncle Owen's voice answering. Owen was one of those people who think that a telephone cannot carry the human voice unless the speaker shouts. "What's that? Men surveying my property? No? Best? No, I don't know anybody named Best. You bet your sweet life I'll stop it." The phone banged down, and Ned heard Owen's voice rise in a shout. "Hey, Debbie, you hear that? There's a gang of men surveying the Grove. I'm heading right down there." Best! Ned sat quietly remembering the huge machines on their fantastic rollers heading towards Hillstown, leaving that strange metal fence to mark their passing. He remembered Mike's words, "Big trouble," and the strange prophetic sound of it. On an instinct he closed the book and stepped out through the French door of his room into the bright sunshine of the summer morning. Owen would drive to the Grove, but Ned knew a short cut and could get there almost as soon as Owen could in the car. There were 4 young men, in bright green trousers and t-shirts of the same color, with "Best" in white letters across their chests. When Ned had come within earshot, Owen was already there. "Trespassing on my property," he heard his uncle say quite loudly. The young men were very polite. They were, one explained, surveying to find precisely where the property line was. "The whole Grove is mine," Owen said angrily. Patiently, politely, they explained that according to their documents, Best owned the land to the left of the line, which ran along the foot of the hill, right where they were standing. "That can't be. I bought this whole tract from Forrest Kingsley 5 years ago. I know exactly what I bought." "I'm afraid Mr. Kingsley didn't own all this tract, sir," one of the young men, obviously the leader of the party, put in. "Best purchased a clear title to this property 6 years ago. It's all in the Land Office records, and I'll be glad to go over there with you and show you." He spoke to his companions. "Knock off for a while, boys. There's no hurry." The young man turned away, courteously gestured for Owen to precede him along the path through the trees, and climbed into Owen's car with him. Ned watched them roar away and knew that his uncle was furious. He always gunned his motor that way when he was angry. The three young men sprawled lazily on the ground and lighted cigarettes. One of them pulled off his green T-shirt and used it as a towel to wipe his face. His skin was brown and smooth, his shoulders and chest powerfully muscled. Lazily he leaned back against a tree and winked at Ned. "Hi, kid," he said, his voice friendly. "You live around here?" "That was my uncle, Owen Bartley," Ned explained. "Fire eater, isn't he?" The man smiled and his face was suddenly very young. "Nice of him to give us a rest." "You mean he really doesn't own all the grove?" "Kid, when Best sends out a surveying team, you can bet your back teeth, your shoes, and your mother in law's best china that they have a claim that'll stand in any court on earth." "What's best?" Ned asked curiously. "You got a nice pair of shoulders, kid." A second man spoke before the question could be answered. "You play football?" "No, basketball," Ned said. "Duke there used to play basketball. In fact, he was an All American with San Francisco. Weren't you, Duke?" The third man grinned lazily and nodded. He had reddish hair, and his skin had the uncomfortable parboiled look of a man who doesn't burn and spends hours in the sun. Expertly he acted on the hint and in a pleasant, unhurried baritone voice engaged Ned in conversation about basketball so agreeably and so easily that when one of the young men got to his feet and announced they'd better head into town for something to eat, Ned had forgotten that his question about Best had not been answered. He remembered it only after they had driven off with their instruments in a green Jeep and he was heading for home to have his lunch. When Ned arrived home, Owen was there, furious. He sputtered and his voice was a snarl as he inveighed against Best, Forrest Sherlock Kingsley, and, oddly enough, Walter Drew's father, Emmett. "Emmett Drew," he snapped. "That white-livered, yellow-bellied ingrate. That stinking coward. You know what he did? He backed them up. He said I had no more title to more than half of the grove. After all I've done for him. That sanctimonious hypocrite, pretending to be my friend. A traitor, that's what he is. A Judas Iscariot. A Benedict Arnold. Don't ever speak to him or his kinsfolk again, Debbie, you hear? Don't let that crippled brat of his into this house as long as you live. I won't have you messing around with the likes of him." Ned gathered that Best had made its claim good. Next morning, moved by curiosity, he visited the grove. It was changed. The end of Owen's property was marked by a line of small red flags. Beyond it the trees had disappeared. The hills looked raw and naked, with the rough markings of caterpillar treads and gouging blades. 10 yards beyond the row of little flags towered a steel meshed fence, topped by a Y-shaped web of barbed wire. On the fence was a large green sign with white letters on it. "Warning: Private property. No trespassing. BEST. Keep out." End of chapter 2. (23) Every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday during the summer months when there was no school, Ned and Walter Drew had a workout in the Hillstown High School gym with Mike Buchan, the athletic director. This morning Ned felt a little uneasy about going to the gym. Owen had forbidden Deborah ever to let Walter into the house again, and he would be furious if he found out that Ned was on his way to spend practically the whole day in Walter's company. Workout was precisely that. Mike was their friend, but he was the coach, and once in the gym he gave orders. They had a definite program. Ned had grown very rapidly, more than 7 inches during the first half of the year, and as a result his arms and legs tended to get in their own way. Mike had designed a course in rope skipping, punching a light bag, gymnastics, and swimming intended to overcome that awkwardness as soon as possible. and Walter, whose right leg had been partly paralyzed by an attack of polio 2 years before, was carrying through a system of exercises worked out by some doctor Mike had known in the Air Force, intended to strengthen what muscles he had left in his right leg and correct a weakness in his left. Walter was sensitive about the withered appearance of his leg, and both Mike and Ned were trying with patience and the warmth of their friendship, with the gentle laughter of real affection, to steel his will against the enervating idea that he was a cripple. Ned enjoyed the workouts hugely. In the shadowy dimness of the empty gym, their voices and their laughter echoed with a friendly sound as they sweated and strained to bring themselves to peak condition. Mike was stocky and rugged, and his body was rock hard and perfectly disciplined. Ned could only marvel at the grace and ease with which the coach went through a slow motion routine on the parallel bars, and the flashing quickness of his movements as he twisted Walter's body into improbable positions on the wrestling mat, forcing the boy to use forgotten muscles and unfamiliar sinews. It looked, and from the sound of Walter's occasional gasps, was painful and even brutal. But there was no doubt about the fact that there had been a steady improvement in both Walter's attitude and in his ability to get around with his brace since they had begun their workouts after school closed. This morning, faintly troubled, Ned stopped skipping his rope and watched the other two engage in a sort of tug of war which found them sitting with their feet braced against each other, holding a short length of rope by handles at either end, each trying to pull the other forward as each leaned back, straining against the rope. They were, with the exception of Father Carson, the only real friends Ned had in town. And now Owen, who already had on more than one occasion expressed disapproval of both the priest and the coach, was making ready, Ned felt sure, to interfere with his friendship with Walter Drew, because Walter's father had not backed up Owen in his quarrel with Best. In Owen's mind, Ned knew, any difference of opinion with him meant the end. Owen was already at odds with a large number of people in town who had disagreed with him for some reason or other, or whom he suspected of having done him wrong. He was, for instance, bitter about Father Carson, the temporary pastor of All Saints Church. Ned learned that Father Bolton, the regular pastor, had suffered a severe heart attack and had gone away for a long rest. The bishop had sent Father Carson, a much younger man, to hold the fort until the older priest was well enough to resume his duties. Owen had no strictures against Father Bolton, except the fact that he was foolish enough to be a Catholic in the first place, but against the younger priest he was bitter. He was convinced that Father had rallied the Catholics of Hillstown against him when he tried to get elected to the school board. The fact that he had no children, and was therefore not regarded as an ideal choice for deciding about the education of children, never occurred to him. He was convinced. That was enough. Added to this was the fact that Father Carson's mother had been a Mexican. She was a spick, talked with a Spanish accent all the days of her life, he would say contemptuously. He had a similar axe to grind about Mike Pewickin. His father had been a refugee, a Pole. "Dirty Pollock," was the way Owen phrased it. "Good for nothing except digging ditches." The fact that Ned was a Catholic who insisted, quietly and without fussing, on being on good terms with the only Catholic priest in town, baffled Owen. "Can't understand why you want to see that limping little spick priest," he said over and over. "People are saying you're too close to him. They're not liking it, boy. You ought to watch it." Ned ignored him. Father Carson was a short, energetic man who walked with a decided limp. His left leg had been shattered in an accident in the seminary, and all sorts of surgery had been tried on him, with the result that the leg was a little shorter than its mate, and that had made it impossible for him to fulfill his life's ambition of going on the foreign missions. "So I took up astronomy, math, and physics instead of languages," he once said matter-of-factly. "I'll be ready to act as chaplain when we take off for places like Mars and Venus." He grinned. His rooms were cluttered with books of all sizes, including a large and fascinating collection of gaudy paperbacks about space, space travel, and similar scientific and pseudoscientific fiction. He also owned, to Ned's delight, practically every book Ned's father had written. "Your father was a great man, Ned," he had told the boy solemnly, as soon as he found out who he was. "He never wrote or said anything that was not intelligent and profoundly true. I felt a great personal loss when he was killed." "So did I, Father," Ned had answered simply, feeling a sudden sense of loneliness, and the priest had put an oddly comforting hand on his shoulder. "Now he knows that everything he said was true, and I think he's not only having a perfectly wonderful time in heaven with your mother, but he's keeping a wary eye out for you, too. Otherwise, you probably would not have landed here where I can look after you, as I intend to do, if you let me." Somehow that had sounded just like his father, and Ned had nodded, a little choked up, and arranged to act as altar boy on Monday, Tuesday, and Saturday, when Father Carson said Mass at All Saints Church in Hillstown. Some of the grammar school boys would handle it on Sunday. The other days Father said Mass elsewhere. I'm chaplain at Baldwin's, and they're entitled to some of my time, too. Ned had no idea what or where Baldwin's was. A convent, he supposed, or a hospital, or some town in the neighborhood. Ned found his friendship with Father Carson something completely natural. Priests of every size and color had always been welcome in his father's home in Larchmont, where Ned had lived very happily with his father and mother. Then a plane came whistling out of the gray sky one fateful afternoon, changing the house into a smoldering pit in the ground. All that was left of his parents, who were home at the time, was a little bit of charred bone and some barely identifiable jewelry. Just enough for a funeral. Owen disapproved of his friendship with Father Carson. Ned knew his uncle disliked the priest, but he knew that the will which appointed Owen his guardian insisted that Ned's religion was not to be interfered with. A complaint by Ned to the trustees of the estate in New York would be enough to deprive Owen of the generous monthly remittance he received as Ned's guardian. So now Ned stood there watching his friends exercising, and he felt ill at ease. Owen could not interfere with his relations with Father Carson, but he most emphatically could mess up his friendship with Mike and Walter. Almost as if his uneasiness communicated itself to the others, they stopped tugging and turned to him. "And this, Jim," Mike said out of the blue, "I am boss, and your Uncle Owen can climb a gum bush and bury his face in a bucket of chewing gum if he thinks he can tell me who can speak to whom, and who can be with whom in here. If you like, I can write this on a piece of paper and send it to him special delivery. Now let's cut the horsing around and get downstairs to the pool." The speed with which news traveled in Hillstown always amazed Ned. From Mike's remark it was clear that by now everybody knew about Owen's quarrel with Walter's father. 2 hours later, refreshed, cool, pleasantly fatigued, yet thoroughly invigorated by the workout, they stepped out of the gym and headed down to the road where Mike's car was parked. The easiest way to Walter's house was to swing down Route 87 for 6 blocks and then turn into the main street of the town. Now, as they were ready to start, they came to a halt and stared. Route 87, normally very lightly trafficked, was jammed. Bumper to bumper, in every size and shape, trucks rolled along 87 towards Dumas and Amarillo, and everyone was painted bright green, with the letters BEST in bold shining white upon their sides. End of chapter 3. (22) During the weeks that followed, Ned and practically everybody in Hillstown became more or less used to the sight of the great green trucks with their enigmatic lettering rolling along Route 87 on their way to and from the gate on the straightway west of Dumas. The gate, it turned out, was a rather elaborate double affair, and the curious who tried to turn into it were met by armed guards who informed them very politely, but none the less very firmly, that this was private property, and unless they had a pass they could not enter. One impetuous soul attempted to ignore the guards and drove past, only to find himself face to face with a second and rather massive gate blocking his way. While he sat there, uncertain about what to do, the gate swung open and a huge green machine on caterpillar treads rumbled out, put its massive front against his bumpers, and with the utmost gentleness pushed his car back onto the public highway and disappeared again. It was perfectly obvious that Best was not interested in having visitors, and after that incident it became noised around that the whole fence was constantly patrolled by men with rifles and savage dogs, whose job it was to keep trespassers out by any and all means. Then one of the enterprising reporters of the Hillstown Herald had a brilliant idea. He stopped at the gate, explained who he was, and asked to see someone in authority. Within a few minutes a Mr. Will Trask arrived at the gate and explained all. Best was one of the vast Baldwin enterprises, engaged in conducting research in silicates. Silicate testing, he called it. Since some of the tests were quite risky, involving the possibility of explosions and radioactivity, it was necessary for them to be conducted in a sort of splendid isolation, where there would be no danger to anyone other than those employed specifically to run such risks. Mr. Trask regretted the apparent lack of hospitality, but he was sure people would understand. He personally would be very happy to conduct the press around the place. After the reporter had signed a document waiving all claims to damage for personal injuries incurred, he was taken inside and conducted through a vast and bewildering series of prefabricated buildings, humming with machinery too complex and too varied for the uninitiated to understand. The general impression the reporter received was that the place was a beehive of activity, where a small army of healthy looking, obviously intelligent men, most of whom were astonishingly young, worked with great enthusiasm. The reporter admitted candidly that for the most part he could not understand what they were doing, because no matter how simply they attempted to put things to him, they inevitably wound up using a language so technical and so filled with scientific jargon, involving isotopes, resistances, liquescences, stresses, and the like, that they were soon beyond his depth. He gathered that the work involved considerable risk, but that everybody was very happy about it, because the pay was excellent and the working conditions were as good as could be expected, and were improving all the time. All in all, it was a very friendly article, and Hillstown breathed more easily. Then forced Sherlock Kingsley and his son arrived. Ned met Robson Kingsley one morning 3 weeks after school had begun, when the principal escorted a stranger into Mike Buchan's math class and presented him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said formally, "this is Robson Kingsley, the son of one of our leading citizens, who has just returned to Hillstown after spending a long time in Georgia. I am sure you will make him welcome." Robson was a tall, dark-haired boy with a faint swagger and a somewhat petulant mouth, which emphasized rather than detracted from his amazing good looks. He was, Ned thought, the handsomest human being he had ever seen. Wide dark eyes, straight nose, firm chin. His head was narrow and shapely, his body beautifully proportioned, and he moved with the grace and litheness of a cat. Mike started class, and after 5 minutes or so Kingsley interrupted with a question. The teacher's face became quite expressionless as he answered it. Then the new student asked another question, and Mike suggested that it might be better to see him that afternoon after classes were over, and continue with what he had been saying. Ned felt a little uneasy. There was a sudden new tension in the room, a faint atmosphere of uncertainty and hostility which he found a little distracting. It was not made easier by the fact that Robson Kingsley, in the back of the room, kept moving restlessly and quite audibly. Ned met the senior Kingsley at Owen's home that night. Forced Sherlock Kingsley was a tall man, slender and distinguished looking, with a striking head of wavy, snow-white hair, and a ruddy, youthful face. He came, he said in a rich bass voice that flowed out of him with effortless ease, to make amends to Owen. He had sold him the grove of trees in complete good faith, under the impression that it was part of the land acquired from his dear wife, God rest her. He wanted to return half of Owen's original payment, since he understood that Owen had been deprived of almost half of his property by Best. Owen, of course, was delighted, and since he had a great deal of charm when he chose to exercise it, dinner that evening was one of the most pleasant meals Ned had eaten since his arrival in Hillstown the previous year, and yet, somehow, he felt that there was something wrong. Until the day his parents had been so tragically killed, Ned's life had been spent in an atmosphere rich in shadings and nuances. His mother, a concert pianist, had been constantly concerned with the interpretation and meaning of music, and this concern had overflowed into her manner of speaking, so that when she said something her tone and her gestures revealed her meaning. Ned remembered one occasion when his father wanted a Madame Moosbrugger to give Ned piano lessons. "I heard Moosbrugger in Prague," his mother had said in her softly accented English, "when I was a little girl. She played Liszt wonderfully. And that," she went on, cupping Ned's chin in her hand and flicking his nose delicately with her slender finger, "that takes patience, which is what anybody needs who tries to teach you anything, Buster." Her gesture, together with the laughter and pride in her voice, showed quite clearly that far from thinking Ned a trial to any teacher's patience, she regarded him as a remarkable character who could learn anything without the slightest trouble. So Ned had learned early to look for shadings and intonations, and to listen with great care not merely to words but to the overtones and undertones of talk and gesture. And there was something here in the amiable exchange of pleasantries between Owen and the senior Kingsley which didn't quite ring true. "They don't trust each other," he thought. "They're maneuvering, looking for an opening, like wrestlers." He decided he didn't like either Kingsley. And it wasn't until he was in bed that night, looking at a lone red star through a leafy tunnel outside his window, that he realized what had crystallized his dislike. Kingsley had said that Owen had been deprived of half his property by Best. Ned had an instinctive dislike for dishonesty. The land had never been Owen's property. End of chapter 4. '21. The days passed quickly, crammed with activity. Father Bolton, the pastor who had been away for so many months, recovering his health, came back, and Ned agreed to serve Mass every weekday morning instead of just 3 days as formerly. Father Carson was away much more frequently now, but the pastor was a very friendly and thoroughly pleasant man, and Ned got along very well with him too. Ned liked to serve daily Mass, and his friendship with the priests was a source of bewilderment to Deborah. "I can't understand it." She shook her head wonderingly as Father Bolton's car drove up to her front door, deposited Ned, and rolled away again. "I declare I just can't understand it. I always thought parsons and preachers and such were too busy being holy to go traipsing around town like that. Why, he acts just like you're giving him a whole year's crop of wheat for himself." "He likes me." Ned grinned at her. He liked Deborah, and felt oddly protective toward her. "He thinks I'm hot stuff, and you know something? He's right." He winked at her extravagantly, and then in an exaggerated imitation of Owen's tenor drawl, "Debbie, get me my breakfast, will you, honey? I haven't had a thing since last night, and I declare I'm starving to death." Deborah laughed, and they went into the kitchen. "Ned," she asked, as she moved around the stove, "how come you go to church every day? I thought Catholics only went on Sundays." So he told her. All his life, as far back as he could remember, his father, his mother, and he had gone to Mass and Communion every day. "My mother used to say that no woman could really ever satisfy a man and make him happy by herself, and she had 2 men, so she needed extra help. It kept the 3 of us together, even when Dad was away giving a lecture or she was somewhere giving a concert. I don't think I've missed a day outside of times when I was sick and couldn't go. It just doesn't seem right to start the day any other way than by receiving the Lord and asking Him to make sure everything goes right, does it?" "You must have been a very happy family," Deborah said slowly. "Oh, we were," he concurred heartily. "You miss them, Ned?" "Sometimes, Debbie. Sometimes I miss them like crazy. But one of the things they always taught me is that life never stops, no matter what happens. There's always today to live, and you can make it rich and exciting even if you miss somebody. Dad used to talk and write about that a lot. A zest for life, he called it. Gratitude for being. I figured that the reason they were killed and I wasn't was because the Lord decided that their work was done, and I still have some job to do, like getting married and having kids of my own, or writing books, or going to the moon or something. So I go to Mass and Communion every morning and ask Him to help me do as well as possible whatever it is I'm supposed to do." She told him over a hearty breakfast of pancakes about the Kingsleys. They were, she said, probably the richest people in town, but there was a tragedy in their life. Robson's mother had gone mad 5 years ago come Thanksgiving, and had almost killed her boy. She had been put away in an institution and died there shortly afterwards, screaming to be released. Her husband and son had gone somewhere east, to Georgia, she thought, to get away from the scene of the tragedy, and she didn't blame them for that. Somehow, she sounded vaguely puzzled. "What I can't figure out," she said, "is why they came back." "I suppose they got homesick," Ned suggested. "I suppose so." Deborah shrugged, without conviction. "Only I don't remember their liking it here before. Robson especially. He used to be a little bully." That afternoon Ned discovered that Robson had changed. He had become a big bully. It happened in the gym where the basketball squad was practicing. Mike was running what he called a fundamentals drill in dribbling, passing, and ball control when Kingsley came into the gym wearing shorts and basketball shoes. "May I join in?" he called. Mike nodded, and the practice went on. Robson was strong and agile, and handled the ball well. Ned admired the smooth grace and precision of his movements. Then gradually Ned became aware that the practice was a little bit rougher than usual. Mike insisted on a perfectly clean style of play. "This is a game of skill," he would say, "not brute force. More games are lost by fouls than any other way. Don't touch the man you're covering." Inside of 5 minutes, Robson Kingsley managed to bump, hard, against practically everyone on the squad. Ned could see the coach getting annoyed. His face became slowly more and more expressionless. "Kingsley," he said quietly, "cut out the rough stuff." "Yes, sir." The boy nodded and smiled, but his expression was not quite pleasant. "Sorry, sir." Ball handling drill was followed by calisthenics. The coach insisted that to play basketball well it was necessary to be in tip-top condition, and the early days of practice consisted of two parts. The first one, when the players were fresh, was given over to the techniques of the game proper, to developing ease and deftness in handling the ball. The second half was given to a routine of exercises calculated to toughen the muscles and develop the wind. It was a rugged program, with the coach himself participating and keeping an eagle eye out to ensure that everybody did everything. There was no time to rest. Push-ups, sit-ups, and stretching and limbering exercises for chest, back, leg, arm, shoulder, stomach, and waist muscles followed one another without let-up until every muscle was quivering with fatigue, and the breath came in and out of sweat-streaked bodies with great heaving gasps through dry throats. Ned had spent hours and hours during the summer engaging in just such workouts, and as a result he was already in excellent shape. He enjoyed it, despite the fact that it was grueling. But Robson Kingsley, who for all his beautiful physique was not in particularly good condition, found it, apparently, too much to take. At the end of the second lap of a 20-lap run around the gym, he dropped out and sat panting near Walter Drew, who was sitting on the bench watching. Walter was a student manager at basketball. Kingsley picked up a Turkish towel from the bench, dipped it in the bucket of cold water beside Walter, wrung it out, and proceeded to wipe his red face and heaving chest with it. Gradually his breath evened out, and he kept watching the others running doggedly around the basketball court. "This is ridiculous," said Kingsley. "I never knew anything so silly." "That's just because you're a little out of condition," Walter replied cheerfully. "A couple of weeks from now you'll enjoy it." "The coach must be nuts." "We've had good teams ever since he took over," Walter remarked. "He knows his stuff." "I think he's a drip." Kingsley glared at Walter. "That's your opinion," the other said placidly. "You're entitled to it. Personally, I think he's a fine coach." "A lot you know about it, you and your leg." "I've as much right to my opinion as you have to yours." The colour drained out of Walter's face, and his voice took on an edge that made it carry. For a moment there was silence. Then Kingsley swung the wet towel and struck Walter full across the face with it. There was a loud smacking sound, followed by a dull thud, as Walter, attempting to pull back from the unexpected blow, lost his balance and fell backward over the bench, his metal-braced legs striking the floor with a clatter. Ned turned in mid-stride and raced over to his fallen friend. Walter's face was twisted with pain and shocked with surprise, but he managed a tight-lipped smile to show he was all right. Ned helped the boy to his feet, and then he glanced at Kingsley, who was watching, towel in hand, with a satisfied expression on his face. Something exploded in Ned's mind. With a single lithe motion he snatched the towel from the astonished Kingsley, gripped the two ends in one hand, and swung it like a fly-swatter against the smirking face. Right, left, right, left. Robson threw up his arms to protect his face, and Ned switched his attack to the other's body, the wet cloth striking with a loud satisfying slap half a dozen times against the bare flesh, until Kingsley suddenly turned and ran. "Stop it!" Ned heard Mike's voice through the red mist of his anger, and the fury drained out of him. Without a sound he wadded up the towel and flung it after the retreating back. His hands were quivering. He was trembling with anger. "You all right, Walt?" The coach's voice was carefully controlled, tight. "Good. Okay, fellows. Get your showers. See you tomorrow." Ned found Kingsley in the shower room, the marks of the towel clearly visible on his chest and sides. Without a word Ned turned on the hot water and stepped under the spray, feeling the tension and anger washing away. Kingsley glared at him, but said nothing until they were toweling themselves dry outside in the locker room. Kingsley's locker was opposite Ned's, beyond the long wooden bench. As he finished, Kingsley drew himself up to his full height and gingerly touched one of the welts on his chest. "I'll burn you for this," he rasped. "You lay one finger on Walter Drew again," Ned said very distinctly, "and I'll make you regret it as long as you live. Only a coward and a bully would hit somebody with his leg in a brace." For a long moment their eyes met, the dark eyes smoky with fury, the blue ones icy with scorn and contempt. Then Kingsley turned his back, and Ned finished dressing in silence and went home. End of chapter 5. 20. The following afternoon, when Ned came out of the gym after practice and was waiting for Walter to finish off his last-minute managerial details, he was surprised to see the police chief's car drive up to the gym door. "Ned!" The burly man at the wheel leaned out and called him. "Come in here, will you, son? I want to talk with you." "Sure thing, Mr. Drew." Ned had met Walter's father several times and liked him. There was an honest ruggedness about him that struck a pleasant note in contrast to Owen's unpredictable behavior and constant striving for effect. "I heard some of the kids talking about what happened in there yesterday," the chief said slowly. "I wanted to thank you. And to warn you." "Warn me?" "Yeah. I'm afraid you've made an enemy, son. Young Kingsley's not likely to forget that you whipped him in front of the whole squad. You'd better watch out for him. He's liable to be dangerous." "Dangerous?" Ned asked. "I don't understand. It wasn't anything important. I got angry and whipped him, that's all. It was a fair fight. Ask anybody." "I know it was a fair fight, Ned. That's not what I mean." "Well then, I don't see why "Listen, son. That boy's a bully, and he holds grudges. You and Walt, if ever you get in a fight, can go right back and be friends again with the fellow you fought. Rob Kingsley's different. Once he takes a dislike for anybody, it's for life. So you watch out for him." "I can handle him," Ned said confidently. "All right. Have it your own way. Only remember, his father carries a lot of weight in this town, and Robson's going around with a bunch of young hoodlums who think they're too big for everybody around here. You're big enough and strong enough to handle him by himself, but I'd hate to have you tangle up with a dozen of those punks he pals around with." "I'll be careful," Ned replied. "Thanks." Mr. Drew grinned suddenly. "Must have been quite a sight, that guy being whipped with a wet towel." He paused, and his face became serious again as he turned away and looked straight ahead through the windshield in some embarrassment. "Walt's pretty important to me, Ned. I want you to know that you're always welcome in my house, any time, day or night." He drove away, leaving Ned staring after him with a fine feeling of warmth inside him. It was wonderful, he thought, to have friends. End of chapter 6. (19) Autumn passed swiftly and winter came. The winds howled down the Great Plains from Canada, chill and cutting, bringing leaden skies that never quite fulfilled their promise of rain. School settled to a routine, and the basketball squad was cut to 20 boys, with Ned winning a job as a regular forward. He was tall and agile, light on his feet, and strong enough to play a whole game at top speed without slowing up noticeably. Owen never said anything about the incident with Robson Kingsley, but Ned was positive he knew and disapproved of it. With typical indirectness, Owen insisted that Ned must under no circumstances let basketball interfere with his study. To Ned, brought up among books and gifted with a first-class memory, this was easy. He did so well, as a matter of fact, that first Walter and then others had long ago fallen into the habit of calling him Brain. Then Owen thought it might be a good idea if Ned were to get a part-time job after school and earn some of his spending money. A man not to spend only what he earns. This was obviously intended to keep the boy from playing basketball. Ned merely nodded. Later he talked the matter over with Mike. Since Owen had not said explicitly that he should work every afternoon, they consulted Mr. Allen, the school principal, and arranged for Ned to act as tutor to a group of a dozen or so younger students who were having trouble with their studies. Each boy paid him $1 an hour for 2 hours of work a week on Wednesday afternoon. There was no basketball practice on Wednesday since the gym was being used for other things. Ned also got a job helping out at the service station on Route 87 on Saturdays, and this paid him another $8. "I don't know why Owen insists that I work," Ned told Father Carson. "The only thing I ever spend money on is books and an occasional soda, and Miss Deebs gets me the books through the library, so I get them at a big discount. He just doesn't want me to play basketball for some reason. Only I can't figure out what the reason is." "The reason," said the priest realistically, "is simply that your uncle is getting as thick as thieves with Forrest Sherlock Kingsley, and Kingsley doesn't love you any more since you disgraced his son in public." "I did no such thing," Ned retorted. "I merely slapped him with a towel in the relative privacy of the gym because he knocked a cripple down, and I was angry. Do you blame me?" "No," the priest answered. As a matter of fact, I'd have been sorely tempted to mop up the floor with him. But that's the way the ball bounces. I can't understand why anybody's making such a big production of the thing, that's all." "Simple, my boy. It involves the great Kingsleys." "You don't like them, do you?" "They belong," the priest said slowly, "to another persuasion. I pray for them daily. I remember them by name every morning at Mass. And the answer to your question is no, I don't like them." "Why do you suppose they came back?" "My guess would be that their return has something to do with Best." "You mean Kingsley's interested in silicate testing?" For a moment the priest looked at him blankly. "Silicate testing?" he said slowly, his face puzzled. Oh, of course. That article Huzitz wrote. Ned, let me tell you something in confidence. Best doesn't have anything to do with silicates, except maybe very remotely. Best stands for Baldwin Enterprises Space Travel. What that reporter saw was the machinery they were getting together so they could start working. Trask figured that if he made the work sound complicated enough and dangerous enough, it would keep away a lot of busybodies. So they did a beautiful snow job on that poor guy. Actually, Baldwin's building a spaceship there." "Come on, Father." "Fact. So help me. I ought to know. I'm chaplain of the project. Where do you think I've been going all these weeks? I told you very distinctly that I'm chaplain at Baldwin's. Didn't you understand?" "No, I guess I didn't. I thought Baldwin's was a town around here somewhere. You know, I've never left Hillstown since I came, except to go to Amarillo and Dumas a few times, and once to Dalhart. Big deal. There could be dozens of places around here named Baldwin's, for all I know. Are you really serious? They're building a spaceship behind that fence?" "I'm serious, all right. I'm grim, in fact. Didn't you read yesterday's paper? Don't you ever listen to the radio or look at your Uncle Owen's TV set? Does the word Sputnik strike a chord?" "Sure, I heard all about that. And I heard all they said about Vanguard and the rockets and Cape What's its name in Florida and Von Braun and Walalay and the rest of it. But a spaceship? How big is it? What does it look like? Can you get me in to see it?" "Whoa, boy, back up a bit there. I don't know what it looks like. They're building it in a closed off section, and I doubt if I can get you in. This is pretty secret stuff, you know. I've told you this in the strictest confidence, Ned. You're not to mention this to a soul, understand? Not Walt nor Mike nor anybody. Is that clear?" "Right," Ned nodded. "Not a word." Then he looked at the priest for a long moment. "Will you try to get me in to see it?" "All right, I'll ask. Only I wouldn't count on it if I were you." "Sure," Ned agreed slowly. "I won't count on it. But it sure would be something. A real spaceship. Judas Rip, will it work, do you think?" "I don't see why not. They're putting all sorts of money and all sorts of brains into it down there, and they're pretty sure they can do it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they can. In fact, I'd be surprised if they didn't. Remember, not a word." "Right." Ned nodded again. "Not a word." It was only when he went to bed that night, still turning the amazing news over in his mind, that Ned remembered. He hadn't asked what connection there could possibly be between the Kingsleys' return to Hillstown and Best. End of chapter 7. 18. The winter melted into the spring, and the winds were no longer freezing knives. They had a damp softness about them, and they brought clouds which melted into endless hours of unpleasant drizzling rain that made everybody quite uncomfortable and very cheerful. This was just what the ground needed for a good crop. The discomfort and the cheer were both typical. It seemed to Ned that the whole town was in the throes of something vague and uncomfortable. People seemed a little gayer than usual, and there was an edge of worry about the cheer. Voices were a little too merry. Laughter was a little too loud. He thought that maybe the secret knowledge he was carrying inside him made him look at everybody suspiciously, afraid that they might somehow, through some careless look or some incautious word, reveal what he had agreed to keep silent. It made him jumpy. "For heaven's sake," Walter said impatiently on one occasion when Ned had reacted somewhat vehemently to a mention of Sputnik II. "What's the matter with you? You're edgier than a disc harrow. Everybody is. I can't figure it. My father goes around looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to come out and shoot him when he wasn't looking. You should have heard him carry on about the Sons of the Vigilantes last week." The Sons of the Vigilantes were a new thing in town. and Mr. Preston had suddenly appeared from somewhere shortly after New Year's Day and had set up headquarters in an old building next to the oldest theatre in town. This theatre boasted the astonishing name of the Hillstown Cinema, and showed nothing but cowboy pictures. Mr. Preston had cleaned up the place, put up a large sign with the single word "Alert" in Technicolor red, and was in business. He dealt in lightning, thunder, fire, and brimstone, and his strident voice threatened doom and destruction to everybody and everything in Hillstown, the county, Texas, and the universe, unless there was a speedy and rapid transformation. His high decibel harangues and his terrifying oratory had a sort of compelling power about them which drew people almost against their will to his headquarters. He sounded like the voice of doom, and his followers, merely a handful for a few weeks, suddenly began to grow in numbers. They were voluble, too, men and women who talked tirelessly to anyone who would listen, and even to those who would not. "It's fascinating," Mike told Ned one day. They had finally managed to get away from a thin man with angry eyes and a strident voice who'd forced his way into the gym after practice. "I've never heard a single one of those sons mention anything they're for. All they talk about is what they're against, and they seem to be against everything but breathing, provided you don't breathe too deeply. Maybe the reason the thing's become so popular is because it makes it possible for everybody to hate and despise everybody else and feel virtuous as all get out about it." He rubbed his hands together briskly, as if they were suddenly cold. "Did you see that man's eyes? A real fanatic if ever there was one. I'm beginning to think they're a dangerous crowd. They could be whipped up to set fire to every house in Hillstown and still be convinced they were doing a good thing by wiping out this den of evil. They scare me." The sons became suddenly very important to Ned personally. Mr. Preston, in the middle of one of his violent harangues, dropped dead. And to Ned's surprise, Forrest Sherlock Kingsley, who had joined the movement only the previous week, succeeded Mr. Preston as chief of the Sons of the Vigilantes, a step which lent the organization additional importance and stature. Kingsley proved every bit as adept and florid an orator as his predecessor. In fact, he brought to the post the additional advantages of an excellent vocabulary and an aura of dignity which Mr. Preston had lacked. 3 days after Kingsley took over the Sons, Owen, who up to this point had regarded all religion with a supercilious expression and repeatedly stated that he couldn't possibly join any one church because this would disappoint and anger all the others, became overnight an ardent Son. This step added to the tensions in the Bartley household. At first Deborah, who was a Baptist, was delighted at the thought of her husband joining any group with religious overtones, but she soon discovered that one of the main duties of a son of the Vigilantes was to disapprove, loudly and at length, of everybody else's attitude, activity, and thinking. Beer and tobacco were suddenly both creatures of Satan, so Owen gave up both of them. Owen had been a heavy smoker, and his lengthy business deals involving the huge farm machinery he dealt in had usually involved the consumption of many a glass of the brew. As a result, while he lived up to his renunciation with exemplary determination, he became irritable, nervous, and almost impossible to live with. Deborah bore the brunt of his increasingly sharp temper and his righteous wrath with astonishing patience. Ned took the easier way out. He left for All Saints in the morning to serve Mass before Owen got up, and took shelter in his room immediately after supper, on the perfectly reasonable grounds that it was his bounden duty to keep up with his studies. Since not even a son of the Vigilantes could find much wrong with doing one's duty, Ned managed to get out from under Owen's incessant complaints about everything. The door to Ned's room, however, was never an effective barrier for Owen's penetrating tenor voice, and Ned gradually learned to ignore the almost uninterrupted sound of his uncle criticizing Deborah and lamenting that the boy was spending so much time with Catholics and foreigners. Deborah, who had always looked harmless and soft, began to lose weight under the strain, and her eyes took on a haunted look. Ned thought she looked as if she were terrified of mice and was constantly expecting to find them running up her legs. The Sons of the Vigilantes, among other things, disapproved of books. "Only one book, the Word of God, has any real value. The others are all meant to seduce and deceive, filling the mind and heart with vain ideas, with desires and lusts and wickedness." Owen, whose house at Ned's coming had contained only an uncut set of Tennyson, mouthed the syllables unctuously. "Ever notice," Police Chief Drew asked Ned one night, "how the Sons love to roll words like seduce, lust, wickedness, and such around in their mouths? You never hear them say a word about love or charity or faith or virtue or anything good like that." Ned immediately took the prudent step of packing into a bundle the books he had bought and taking them over to Walt Drew's house for safe keeping, where Walt willingly made room for them on his shelves. Father Carson drove by one day unexpectedly and left Ned a bulky package, which turned out to be the priest's collection of paperback science fiction. After some thought Ned transported these books to the school and piled them on the floor of his locker, covering them with a heavy cardboard to protect them from the inevitable sweaty things he jammed in with them. He read them in the gym after practice, to the amusement of the coach and the bewilderment of his teammates, who considered them "for the birds." For the most part Ned succeeded in not allowing himself to become involved in arguments with his uncle. It was hard at times to keep from answering back, but Father Bolton, who was very much aware of what the sons of the Vigilantes did, assured him that he would accomplish nothing by arguing except make hard feelings. "They're not interested in reasons," he said quietly, "and they have no concern about anybody's rights. You just have to put up with whatever your uncle says, and remember that in Scripture it says, 'A soft answer turneth away wrath.' You just ignore your uncle's remarks and concentrate on being a good Christian." He smiled. "Nobody ever said that being a Christian was easy, you know. I imagine the Lord was rather annoyed at being scourged and crucified. But He managed to bear it, and He's the example you have to follow, not Owen. I think maybe living with a crackpot son of the Vigilante will do you good. I have some books you ought to read which will make you realize how much better off you are than those poor deluded people. And you don't have to worry about the books. If Owen thinks they're Satan's tools and burns them, I have more." Ned tried very hard to follow the priest's instructions and kept a tight control over his temper and his words, avoiding Owen as much as possible and refusing to be drawn into arguments. Whenever Owen upbraided him, which he did more and more frequently, about being a Catholic, Ned had an answer which he had worked out with Mike. "You'll just have to pray hard that I see the light, Owen. I guess I've just not been chosen." This baffled Owen. The sons of the Vigilantes insisted that they were "chosen," and this apparent oversight on the part of Providence, with the suggestion that Owen might help, served to cut the ground out from under his uncle's feet and made it possible for Ned to turn the conversation into one of the increasingly fewer neutral channels. Ned sensed that an open break, maybe even an explosion, was bound to take place between himself and his uncle, and that there was no way he could possibly prevent it, however adroitly he managed to postpone it by refusing to get into arguments and by pleading inability to see the light. In a dim sort of way he felt sure that there were forces gathering for some sort of violent and definitive struggle, and he was certain that somehow he was fated to be right in the middle of it. Still, when he lay quietly in his bed at night looking at the cold stars through the bare branches of the tree outside his window, things didn't seem too bad. He hugged his secret to himself and thought that some day, not too long hence, he might be lucky enough to see a streak of flame rising into the sky and hear a little later the distant roar of the spaceship's violent departure. From what he had read and from what the paperback cover artist had imagined, he carefully formed a mental picture of what they were building beyond the steel fence only a few miles away. It would be tall and slender, pointed and graceful, a mighty dart to pierce the heavens. It would be built in stages which would burn their mighty charges of exotic fuel in seconds and send the last graceful element through the black emptiness of space to places no man had ever seen. Idly he saw himself as part of the crew that manned the Wonder. Ned Bartley, spaceman. It had a swing to it. And after all, why not? He was young and healthy. His body was sturdy and powerful, his muscles firm. Certainly he could stand the enormous strains of fantastic accelerations and the stress of weightlessness in "no grav." Silently he laughed at himself. He wasn't old enough to get a full-grown driver's license. Fat chance he had of sitting at the controls of a spaceship when he couldn't sit at the wheel of his uncle's car. End of chapter 8. The big rain began Sunday evening after supper with a light, hesitant sprinkle. The day had begun bright and sunny, with clean blue skies and the air fragrant with the scent of spring. Ned, Mike, Walter Drew, and a couple of the other boys on the basketball team had met by chance as they were coming out of the 9 o'clock Mass and had organized an impromptu picnic. There followed a flurry of telephone calls from Father Bolton's house notifying assorted parents, and then they clambered into Mike's car and set off for the artificial lake formed near Dalhart by a dam across Mustang Creek. They got breakfast in a drive-in on Route 87, and Ned felt a twinge of excitement as they parked their car near one of the monster "best" trucks, whose driver was sitting at the counter drinking coffee. He wondered whether the truck contained any vital part of the spaceship, and looked away guiltily, afraid that his expression might somehow betray a secret knowledge. The water was too cold for swimming, but the grass looked so soft, and the sun was so warm, that they took off their shirts, removed their shoes and stockings, and began an informal soft-ball game with a bat and an old ball they found in the car trunk. Presently a group of youngsters from Dalhart showed up, were delighted with the idea, and a speedy game of barefoot ball went on until they were all pleasantly fatigued. They waded in the icy water, basked in the warm sunshine, slapping away at the mosquitoes that came whining around, ate fairly tasteless sandwiches with voracious young appetites, and finally started for home, tired, happy, and badly sunburned. Ned's sunburn made it hard for him to find a comfortable spot in bed that night, but finally, soothed by the gentle sound of the rain, he fell into a restless sleep. The spaceship was falling into a strange red-violet world where lofty mountains kept changing size and shape with a horribly hungry sort of vitality. Ned Bartley, spaceman, fought desperately to avert the impending disaster. A swarm of meteors drummed against the sides of his ship, and apparently there was a breach somewhere because he could hear the air escaping with a howling noise. Desperately his fingers pressed against the firing studs, and the answering roar of his rockets filled the control room with thunder. Lights blinked on the panel before him, and suddenly there was a blinding flash and a vast explosion. Ned sat up in bed, wide awake. The French door had swung out and had caught on the latch that kept it open, and the white curtains were fluttering and snapping wildly in the wind. A torrential rain thrummed against the roof above his head and came through the French doors into the room. A burst of lightning, accompanied by an ear-splitting crackle of thunder, dazzled him. For a moment he sat there trying to shake off the vivid reality of the dream, and then he was on his feet, padding across the wet floor to the French door. The rain was icy, and in an instant he was drenched. In the darkness he had trouble finding the catch, but finally, soaked to the skin, with his wet pajamas sticking clammily to his sunburned body, he got the door closed and fastened. He switched on the light and groaned at the sight of the puddle on the floor. Owen would have things to say about that unless he did something about it immediately. Chilled and shivering, he got a couple of soiled towels from the hamper in the bathroom and mopped up the puddle, drying off the floor as best he could. Then he shed his dripping pajamas, wiped himself off, rubbing tenderly because of his sunburn, and hunted unsuccessfully for a dry pair of pajamas, while his skin roughened with goose flesh. After a few moments he gave up the futile search, snapped off the light, and crawled between the sheets to lie there shivering violently with a chill that reached to the marrow of his bones. It was not until he had lain for a long time, curled up on his side with his knees against his chest and his arms around his legs, several blankets piled upon his shaking body, that he began to thaw out and feel warmth creeping back into his chilled flesh. In the morning Ned awakened with a throbbing headache, a stuffy nose, a sore throat, and stiff, sore muscles all over his body. Outside the rain fell monotonously in a steady, heavy downpour. He was sitting on the bed in his trousers, struggling awkwardly to put on his socks, when Deborah knocked, as she had done every morning since their talk about daily Mass, to see that he was up. "I'm up," Ned called, his voice a hoarse croak. For a moment there was silence, and then she knocked again. "Ned, you hear me? Are you up?" He walked stiffly to the door, one sock half on, one foot bare, and opened it. "I'm up," he said hoarsely, with what he hoped was a pleasant smile. "My goodness!" Her hand flew to her throat. "You all right? You look like death warmed over." She placed a cool hand on his forehead and drew it quickly back, her eyes wide with sudden anxiety. "You're burning up, Ned. You get right back into that bed this instant, you hear? You're not going anywhere today. Not in this rain you're not." Meekly he obeyed her. He felt terrible. Later he dozed, and then the doctor came and put his cold little gadget against Ned's hot body, listening, looked at his throat, and shook his head. "You stay in that bed at least 3 days, boy," he said sternly. "Don't get out of it for anything except to use the toilet. And get some pajamas on you. I'll get you some medicine. You'll be all right after a while." The medicine was a bitter liquid in pills. Ned dozed and dreamed irrational crazy stuff. He burned up and froze alternately, and sipped the hot broths Deborah brought him from time to time. All in all he put in a thoroughly miserable Monday and Tuesday, and all the time the rain fell steadily, without let-up. Wednesday the fever was gone, and his nose began to feel smaller, his throat less dry. The rain still fell. Thursday he felt infinitely better and a little restless in bed. The doctor appeared, listened to him again through his stethoscope, nodded, told him to keep up the good work and stay in bed till Saturday, and disappeared. The rain fell steadily all day and all night, Friday. Saturday he finally got up, weak and unsteady on his legs, but glad to be out of bed. His nose and throat felt normal again, and he knew the cold was done. Grippe it was, Deborah informed him, and Doc said lucky it wasn't pneumonia. He said you're not to step outside this house until the weather's clear again, or he won't be responsible. Ned sat and read and listened to the radio and looked at the rain. Deborah came in and they sat and talked pleasantly during the afternoon. "You feel well enough to have supper with Owen and me?" she finally asked. "Sure." He smiled, wondering what was on her mind. "This rain's made everybody jittery," she said carefully. "Your Uncle Owen's mighty edgy these days, Ned. Please try not to say anything that'll start an argument." She flushed and went on. "I know you always try not to argue, Ned, but please try extra hard tonight. Remember, you've been mighty sick." "All right, Deborah," he smiled. "I'll be extra careful." He was, but it didn't work. Owen somehow got on the subject of foreigners. Forrest Sherlock Kingsley had given the Sons of the Vigilantes a semi-religious slant, with many references to Satan and Belial, and it had gradually become clear that foreigners were, along with alcohol and tobacco, one of the great evils unleashed upon humanity by Satan. It was up to the pure-blooded Americans to counteract this satanic threat. It was, of course, not quite clear just who were pure-blooded Americans. Ned gathered that Mexicans, Jews, Negroes, Catholics, and anyone who disagreed in any way with the Sons of the Vigilantes were foreigners. Owen was very vehement on the subject. Not only that, since he had become a son, Owen's language had changed, and his talk was sprinkled liberally with expressions that were coarse and extremely vulgar. It was language better suited to an army barracks than a dining room, and Ned found himself getting more and more annoyed. Deborah was obviously extremely uncomfortable, and she kept silent, looking from Ned to her husband with pleading eyes. Ned finally felt that he was reaching the breaking point, so he interrupted the diatribe, aimed at the dirty pullock and the little spick, and said, very quietly, that he was feeling very tired, and would Owen mind if he went to lie down for a few minutes? "Can't take it, eh?" Owen glared at him. "Can't stand to know that your friends are foreigners instead of pure-blooded Americans?" Something snapped inside Ned, and he was horrified to hear his voice, cold and cutting. "No. It's just that I keep remembering. My mother was Hungarian, and I distinctly recall my father saying that his grandmother came from Cuba and was probably part Negro." For an instant there was a terrible silence as Owen sorted out the relationships. Then the blood drained from his face and rushed back until he was almost purple. His lips worked silently for a moment, and when his voice came it was a strangled squeak. "Why, you..." He swallowed, making a visible effort, and regained a measure of control over his vocal cords. He cast around, obviously for words, and then in a hissing snarl flung them at Ned. You orphan!" His chair fell crashing to the floor as he stood up and lifted a quivering hand to strike the boy. "Owen!" Deborah's cry was almost a scream. "Don't hit him!" The man turned toward her, and the full fury of his anger spewed out over her. "So you're against me too." Owen spat the words out like bullets, and she cringed against the back of her chair, her face wearing a look of terror. "That's right, protect him. You don't have any kids of your own. Take this sniveling brat." He was in a positive frenzy of rage, and suddenly, as if a dam had burst somewhere, releasing a pent-up flood, the words came out of him in a spat of frustration and hate. Ned was appalled. Obscenities and insults poured out of Owen in a filthy torrent that was sickening. Then Deborah, her face like marble, her eyes suddenly chips of ice, stood up with a sort of majestic dignity and leaned forward in the direction of the furious man, her hands resting on the table, her head erect and proud. "Just a moment, please," she said softly, her voice quivering with outrage. "Just a moment, Owen." Something about her look, about the sound of her voice, dried out the torrent of Owen's abuse, and his voice trailed away to silence. "Just a moment, Owen," she said again in the same quivering, deadly voice. "The only reason we have no son is because you made him try to swim across the lake. You made him, Owen. He begged you not to, but you had to be able to brag that your boy could swim farther than anybody else. It's your fault we have no children." She turned to Ned, her eyes pools of anguish and pity. "I'm sorry, son. You'd better go to bed." Then she walked slowly to her bedroom and softly closed the door, leaving a sort of terrible, exhausted silence behind her. Owen gave a strangled cry and flung himself out of the room into the rainy night, the door slamming flatly behind him, and Ned was alone in the stillness with his hands shaking and the drumming sound of the rain in his ears. End of chapter 9. Deborah knocked on Ned's door as usual the next morning and asked if she could come in. Owen, she told him, had come home about 3, dead drunk, and had passed out on his bed. She wondered whether Ned would mind if she went to church with him. Baptist services were much later in the morning, and she wanted to drive down to Amarillo and visit some relatives. She was sure Ned could arrange to stay away from the house until night. "He used to drink a lot, years ago," she said. "It takes him until late to get back on his feet." The rain had stopped. The sky was a bright blue and looked as if it never had known such a thing as a cloud. Ned waved to Deborah as she started off on her drive and decided that he would just drift around by himself for a while. He wanted to sort things out and get them straight in his mind before having a talk with Father Bolton. It was obvious that something would have to be done. He did not know exactly what right the guardian had over his ward. Aimlessly Ned drifted about. After a while he found himself in the neighborhood of the grove which had brought Owen into contact with Best and sparked his anger at Emmett Drew and his friendship with Kingsley. The ground was soggy and the wet earth clung to Ned's shoes. He rolled up his trouser cuffs to keep them from getting muddy. Then he walked to the fence and along it until he came to the big green sign that warned trespassers to keep out. It was then that Ned found the hole. Torrents of water from the week of rain had sluiced down a gully between 2 low hills and had washed the dirt away from below a portion of the fence. There was a space below the wire wall easily large enough for a man to slide through, if he didn't mind getting his clothes dirty. For a long time Ned stood there looking at it, his heart pounding. Somewhere behind this fence was the spaceship. The fence, it was said, was patrolled day and night by armed men and vicious dogs, but the hole gave that the lie. Patrols wouldn't have stopped because of the rain, and patrols would have discovered this hole and repaired it. Chances were that there was as much truth to the patrol story as there was to the tale of silicate testing. Nevertheless, Ned could not keep his heart from pounding as he looked around to see whether anyone was looking, and then stepped down into the gully and crawled under the fence. He was in the Best compound. Hastily he stood up, his clothing liberally coated with mud, and started scrambling up the barren hillock, anxious to find a height from which he might be able to spot the place where the spaceship was housed. It would, he knew, have to be a vast building. Breathless, he reached the top, straightened up, and found himself facing a short, stocky man carrying a shotgun. For an instant they looked at each other with shocked surprise. "So," the man's deep voice said in a soft, satisfied tone, "I was right. The rain did wash out the fence over here. Who are you?" "You going to shoot me?" Ned asked, his stomach suddenly turning into a cold stone inside him. The man's broad, strong features softened into a sudden smile. "Relax, kid," he said quietly. "Take it easy. Who are you?" Ned swallowed. "My name's Ned Bartley," he said. The man looked at him closely, sudden interest in his face. "You Ed Bartley's son?" he demanded with something like eagerness in his voice. "Your dad was the writer?" Ned nodded, too surprised to speak, and the man's face became suddenly alive with friendliness. "Of course," he said softly. "Of course. You look just like him." He stuck his hand out. "I knew your father, son. I'm Silas Baldwin." Ned felt his hand wrung in a fierce grip, and watched with astonishment as the man's face reflected strong excitement. "So you're Ed's boy. Well, well, imagine meeting Ed Bartley's son here in Texas." He blinked rapidly and shook his head. "Look at you. Those pants are ruined." He laughed, and Ned found himself suddenly clasped in a fierce bear hug. "Bartley's boy," Silas Baldwin said again. "Son, you'll never know how glad I am I came this way today." But what?" Ned found himself stammering in confusion. "Who?" "Never mind," the other laughed out. "Just wait a second." He reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like an oversized police whistle made out of what Ned took to be white porcelain, and proceeded to blow it. Ned heard nothing, but he felt an odd quivering sensation around his ears. "Silent whistle," explained the man. "They'll come and get us in a minute. Come on." "You going to arrest me?" Ned asked, uncertain and confused, and still feeling guilty about trespassing. "Arrest you?" the man laughed. "I'm going to bring you over to meet my family, get you some clean clothes, and have a long talk with you. Don't you understand, boy? Your father was a friend of mine. My name's Baldwin. This is all my property." He laughed again, and the sound was so pleasant and infectious that Ned couldn't help joining him. "My fault," Baldwin said. "Relax, son, relax. It's just that I was so surprised to find out who you were, I keep forgetting there's a lot you don't know. Don't worry, I'll tell you all about it. Bartley's son. I can't believe it. This is incredible." "Look, Mr. Baldwin," Ned said slowly, "I don't know what you're talking about. My father never " His voice died away as a faint memory stirred to life inside him. "Baldwin. Cy Baldwin. Dad used to talk about a Cy Baldwin sometimes. Something about a pot boiler." The memory was so elusive, and the man nodded and smiled again encouragingly. "Yep," he said. "Cy Baldwin. Baldwin Enterprises. Ah, here they come." A green jeep came hurtling toward them, carrying two anxious looking young men with holstered guns at their hips. "It's all right, boys." Silas Baldwin waved a hand airily, and the men's worried faces relaxed in smiles of relief. "This is Ned Bartley, Duke Higgins, and the big one's Steve Westlake." Ned recognized the red-headed surveyor who had talked basketball with him, and shook hands warmly with him, remembering how pleasantly they had gotten on in their previous meeting. Then the big man, Steve Westlake, put out his hand, and Ned found himself looking up into a pair of slate gray eyes, flat and opaque, which stared at him speculatively out of a craggy, fiercely intelligent face. Then the stern look softened into a smile, and the big hand that clasped Ned's felt warm and friendly. Steve Westlake was the biggest man Ned had ever seen, easily 8 inches taller than Ned's own 6'2". The man moved with the grace and ease of a trained athlete in the pink of condition. His massive shoulders and deep chest flared out from slender hips and rode easily on long straight legs. His arms were brown and solid. Steve was, in fact, so perfectly proportioned that he succeeded in making everybody else look undersized. It was not his size that impressed Ned, though. It was true that Steve conveyed the impression that he could pick Ned up and without too much exertion rend him limb from limb with his bare hands. But the striking thing about Steve Westlake was an aura of fierce, controlled recklessness and piercing intelligence. Ned felt that there was nothing, no risk, no danger, that Steve would be unwilling to face, and that under any circumstances the big man's mind would be furiously active and certain to find a solution. He would not, Ned decided, like to have Steve Westlake mad at him. "Pile in," said Baldwin cheerfully. "Let's get home. I'm getting hungry." End of chapter 10. "15. They clambered into the open jeep, Steve at the wheel, Duke beside him, the others in the back seat. The big man brought the motor to roaring life, then turned and looked back at the financier. "There's a plane, Cy. Looks like a recon job. It isn't ours." His finger pointed briefly in the direction of Amarillo, where a tiny speck hung in the clear blue sky. "I can get us home before they're close enough to snap us, I think." "What are you waiting for then? Get moving." "Hang on." Ned hung on grimly. The jeep took off like a scared rabbit and raced over the rough ground at a tooth-rattling speed. In the sky the tiny speck of the plane grew and assumed the appearance of a Piper Cub, flying at a leisurely rate. The jeep roared and rattled, jounced, slithered, and fled along at a heart-stopping pace. The wind brought tears to Ned's eyes, and as they raced ahead he could not clearly see where they were going. The only thing he was sure of was that there was a large, fairly steep hill ahead of them, and that Steve apparently planned to go over rather than around it. Then suddenly, just as Ned was bracing himself for the climb, the wheels screeched, the jeep careened violently, seemed about to stand on its nose, plunged into darkness, and came to a screaming halt. Ned heard feet strike it left and right and pound away. He heard a door slam, then Steve's flat, expressionless voice reached out of the gloom. "Okay, Duke, let's have some light." A second later fluorescent lights came to life, and Ned looked around. They were in a garage. The front end of the jeep was inches away from a solid concrete wall. Silas Baldwin glanced at the wall before him, and then turned slowly to watch Steve walking toward the parked jeep, the pistol banging against his great thigh, the craggy face expressionless, a faint twinkle in the slate gray eyes. "What's the matter, Steve?" he asked dryly. "Why'd you park so far from the wall?" The big man grinned in appreciation of the joke, and Baldwin nodded slowly, his mouth widening into a friendly smile. "Nice driving, Steve. Thanks." "Any time, Cy." Steve winked at him, and Ned felt a sudden liking for him. This, he thought, was a man. "Come along." Baldwin was out of the Jeep now, and Ned stepped down too. "I think the four of us are entitled to a meal after that ride." The garage was huge. In both directions Ned could see the Jeeps, cars, and trucks all painted bright green, lined side by side in long rows that disappeared into the darkness. The four went into a doorless opening to the left of their Jeep, moved down a long corridor, and stepped into a large, low ceilinged room, comfortably furnished, with big leather chairs and sofas. There young men in bright green attire were taking their ease, reading the papers, smoking, talking, and listening to the radio. As they moved through the room, faces turned their way, alert, intelligent faces, and there were brief smiles and nods and occasional breezy exchanges. It was all very friendly, Ned thought, and quite homey. There was about the whole pleasant room the peaceful atmosphere of contentment that marks a place where people like being with each other. For a moment Ned's mind went back to the living room in his father's home. It was totally unlike this great chamber, but somehow it seemed very similar. They entered another long tunnel and moved along it for several minutes. The hill, Ned decided, must be literally honeycombed with corridors and rooms. Almost as if he had caught his thought, Baldwin turned to him and smiled. "How do you like it? Thought it was a hill, didn't you?" He grinned. "It was Steve's idea, you know. He's our camouflage expert and troubleshooter. He covered the whole works with a roof and disguised it as a hill. Great little worker, Steve. My daughter Nancy thinks he's a hero." "She's right." Steve's dry voice carried a chuckle. "I scraped a knuckle once, fixing something for her. If shedding his blood for a woman doesn't make a man a hero in her eyes, what does?" They came into another room, not so large as the previous one, but more luxurious. There were rugs, comfortable chairs, low tables piled with books and magazines, and a grand piano. The walls were lined with filled bookcases. There was a large stone fireplace, and the whole room was bathed in a soft, shadowless light that seemed to come from windows just below the ceiling. The whole effect was cool, airy, and spacious, altogether pleasant. It was, Ned thought, a friendly and gracious room where people could relax and take their ease in comfort. Somebody was doing just that. On the thick rug in front of the fireplace, a boy of about 16 lay stretched out on his back in the bright radiance of a sun lamp. He wore the bright green trousers that seemed to be the preferred attire inside the compound, but he had removed his T-shirt and was using it, carefully rolled up, to cover his eyes. Ned thought he was asleep, with his head pillowed on his hands, but at the sound of their arrival he sat up with a lithe motion and looked at them, shielding his eyes with his hand. His lean, plain features suddenly broke into a welcoming smile that completely transformed his face. It was, Ned thought, as if a sudden bright light had suddenly turned on inside him somewhere. "Hi, Dad." The boy's voice was warm with affection as he scrambled to his feet and came toward them. "Hi, Steve, Duke." "Hi, Muscles." Steve's broad smile made him look, Ned thought, surprisingly young and friendly. "I trust," Baldwin said dryly, a sort of brusque affection in his tones, "that you'll forgive this intrusion on the privacy of your sun bath." "Be my guest," grinned the boy. "That rug's the most when it comes to comfort." "Humph!" Baldwin made a snorting noise. "Ned, this bronzed young giant is my son, Andy. Ned Bartley, son." Ned took the other's hand, noting the firm, warm clasp of it. "Bartley?" Andy's voice was friendly, interested. "Ned? Ed?" His eyes met his father's questioningly, and at a nod, the grip on Ned's hand tightened. "Swell! Bartleys are heroes around here." His smile changed from one of polite welcome to one of genuine friendliness and pleasure. Ned once more had the impression of a bright light coming vividly to life inside the boy. "I'm sure glad to meet you." "Good." The senior Baldwin pursed his lips. "Get into a shirt and get Ned something clean to put on while you do something about that mud. And hurry up. Dinner's in 15 minutes, and we men have some drinking to do before we eat. Right, boys?" Steve chuckled and Duke nodded, smiling. Andy playfully vaulted over a chair, switched off the sun lamp, picked up his rolled up T-shirt, and vaulted back to Ned's side. He was young, exuberantly healthy, and full of fine animal spirits. He swaggered over to Steve and jabbed the big man on the chest with the forefinger. The top of Andy's head just came to the other's Adam's apple. "Listen, Shorty," Andy said sternly, addressing the hollow at the base of Steve's throat. "Don't drink too much, otherwise you'll be too easy to pin. Ock!" He dodged away from the other's lightning lunge. Andy wasn't fast enough. Steve's big hand caught his arm above the elbow and jerked him off balance. As he staggered, Steve caught him with both hands at the waist. just under the rib cage, and hoisted him up effortlessly until their faces were on a level. "You want to tell me something, Muscles?" asked the big man, smiling. "Speak up. I can't hear from down there." "My, you look hot," Andy said with exaggerated solicitude, his feet some 12 inches above the floor. "Let me wipe your fevered brow." He flicked open the rolled up t-shirt. With a swift motion Andy flung it over the other's head and proceeded to rub the swathed face vigorously with both hands. Steve's head bent backward, and with a chuckle Andy ran his forefinger lightly across the big man's throat, from ear to ear. A smothered half laugh came from behind the green t-shirt, and Andy found himself slung over a massive shoulder. Steve cleared away the shirt with a flick of his fingers, flung it aside, and his hands closed with a firm grip on the boy's ankles. With an incredibly swift movement the giant spun around, whirled out from under, and began to swing the boy around by his ankles, like a hammer thrower getting ready to toss. Around and around, shoulders high, at the full length of the extended arms, he whirled the boy dizzyingly, while Andy laughed, gasping for him to stop. Please stop. He'd be good. Gently taking great care not to let the boy bump himself, Steve deposited Andy on the thick rug. Then Steve hauled him to his feet, gasping and shaking his head. For a moment Andy staggered, then caught his balance and stood swaying lightly, a sheepish look on his face as he looked around. He saw his father smiling at him almost tenderly, and grinned back. With a lithe motion he picked up the discarded t-shirt and shook it at Steve, his eyes alive with laughter and something like hero worship. "Let that," he said with thoroughly spurious dignity, "be a lesson to you. Come on, Ned. Let us leave these Earthlings to their carousel." To the sound of delighted laughter Andy strode majestically from the room. Ned found himself drawn to both Andy and Steve. It was obvious that the boy worshipped the man and that the man returned the affection. There had been a sort of careful gentleness about the rough house that raised it to the level of healthy horseplay among good friends. They had obviously done this sort of thing often. As Ned followed the tanned, sinewy figure down a narrow hallway, Andy confirmed this impression by turning to him with a grin and saying, "Steve's really something, isn't he?" End of chapter 11. Andy's room was Spartan. In one corner was a bed covered with a bright blue cloth that reached to the floor. Beside it was a straight-backed chair. Against the opposite wall was an enamel cabinet that looked like a washing machine. The third corner housed a huge desk, on which were a beautifully fashioned model of a delta wing plane with a long fuselage reaching out ahead of the wings, and a white telephone. A plain bureau, a wardrobe, and a comfortable looking contour chair made of what looked like aluminum pipes and rubbery plastic completed the furniture. The floor was bare and made of huge panels of plywood with some hardwood veneer. The canary yellow walls were innocent of all decoration except a small crucifix with an ebony cross and an ivory corpus which hung over the cabinet at the foot of the bed, and a larger carving of St. Andrew on an X-shaped cross which hung at its head. "It's lavish," Andy grinned as he waved his hand around the barren room, "but I call it home. You'll want a shower. It's in there." He pointed to a door. "I'll get you something clean. You can have any color you like as long as it's green." He was opening drawers, taking out cellophane wrapped packages. "Just drop things anywhere. Don't worry about the dirt. Towels are inside there. You live in Hillstown. What's it like? How old are you? Do you play football? You been in Texas long? How'd you get in? Dad find you? Did you climb over the fence? Sometime I'm going to try that. You go to school around here?" Ned almost staggered under the rapid-fire barrage. Then he burst out laughing. Andy's face was bewildered for a second, and then he too started to laugh. In a moment they were both breathless with laughter. Then Andy looked apologetic and said, "I don't get much chance to talk to guys my age. Don't mind me." Clean, dry, and comfortable, they chatted amicably, while Andy gathered up Ned's soiled clothing, shoes and all, and dumped everything unceremoniously into the enamel cabinet and turned a switch. A low humming rose to a high-pitched whine and died away to silence. "Dry washer," Andy grinned. "Sound waves do it all. It takes about an hour. How do you like my St. Andrew?" Ned walked over and looked at the statue closely. It was done in some material he didn't recognize, and carved with infinite painstaking care and skill. The figure was straining and writhing in unbearable agony, the head thrown back in a paroxysm of pain, the features contorted with anguish, and yet at the same time oddly peaceful. Every muscle, every hair, every pore almost, had been wrought with a precision and accuracy that bespoke unlimited patience. It was, he thought, as if someone had nailed a strong muscular man to an X-shaped cross, and at the moment of supreme torment had magically reduced him in size, frozen him into immobility, and fastened him to the yellow wall. "Wow," he said softly. "That's really something." "Steve did it," Andy said slowly. "He gave it to me for my birthday last week. Said he wanted me to remember that I was named after a strong man." He stopped. "You know," he continued, looking at Ned with a wondering sort of expression on his face, "I guess Dad is right. We owe your father an awful lot." Then, before Ned could say anything, his expression changed again. "Come on, let's eat. Do the clothes feel all right?" They felt fine, and they fitted well. Andy was a little shorter than Ned, but not enough to matter. The sandals on Ned's bare feet were comfortable, and the green T-shirt and trousers felt soft against his skin. It was a hearty, pleasant meal, served by a lean negro with dazzling white teeth. Nancy, Andy's twin sister, was a surprise. While Andy was tall and rangy, with thick brown hair and a stiff crew cut, and a pleasantly homely face, redeemed by his bright eyes and flashing grin, Nancy was a frail looking girl with a pale, beautiful face, wavy auburn hair, and the greenest eyes Ned had ever seen. They looked like emeralds. Over coffee, Silas Baldwin explained about the debt he owed Ned's father. The twins had just been born. Ned was about 8 months old then, and Mrs. Baldwin, Lord rest her sweet soul, was terribly ill. Mr. Baldwin was in debt to his ears, out of work and desperate. One night, feeling completely lost, he knocked at the door of his neighbor across the street and found Ed Bartley holding his baby son in one arm and packing a bag with another. He looked harried. But he listened. He had to catch a train, because he was going somewhere to give a lecture. His wife, he explained, was in Milwaukee giving a concert. He was in an awful rush, but he saw I was in trouble, so he sat down, holding the baby on his lap, and listened. Baldwin's voice sounded odd as he recalled the events of that long ago night. "Look," said Bartley, "I have just enough cash, believe it or not, to get me where I'm going tonight, and the $50 or so I'll get wouldn't help you much." He stopped as an idea came to him. "But maybe I have something that will help. Just this afternoon I finished a pot boiler. I've been toying around with it. I think it should go. You take it." He went to the desk and pulled out a sheaf of typewritten pages, which he thrust into Baldwin's hands. "You take it and peddle it, and I hope you get a lot of money and it helps you. Now will you please hold Buster here until I finish packing the bag? I'll never make it otherwise. I'll pray for you, Cy, hard." Baldwin paused and sipped his coffee. Ned glanced around the table and saw the interest written on all the faces. Nancy and Andy, obviously, had heard the story before, but Steve and Duke apparently had not, and they were leaning forward, hanging on every word. "Well, I sent the story in to the Saturday Evening Post. By return mail there was a check for $2,500 and a letter saying they were going to run it in 3 installments. And that wasn't the end. The pot boiler was made into a play and then into a movie. A couple of years later somebody turned it into a musical that broke practically every record, and then they made the musical into a movie. By that time I had not only paid off all my debts, but I'd met Willard Trask, who had a little gadget for oiling train wheels in motion, and that was the start of Baldwin Enterprises. But," he held up his hand, "that's not the whole story. In fact, that's the least important part of the story." He drank some more coffee and went on. "I went back to Bartley when the play deal developed and told him he had given me a gold mine and he ought to share the profit. You know what he did? He laughed and shook my hand. 'Cy,' he said, and I can remember his very words, 'I gave you that pot boiler and everything you could get out of it. It makes me feel wonderful to know it was a good gift. Don't spoil it by trying to make me take it back. Keep every cent of it and enjoy it in good health. Maybe someday you can do as much for somebody.'" Baldwin paused again and smiled as at a pleasant memory. "Well," he continued, "I went home and talked things over with my wife, and we decided that the reason Ed Bartley was so unconcerned about money was that he had something maybe better. He had faith and he lived by it. He had a real supply of Christian charity and generosity on tap. I never saw two people so completely unworried about the future as Mr. and Mrs. Ed Bartley. Well, to make a long story short, my wife and I and the 2 kids wound up getting baptized one Sunday afternoon, with the Bartleys standing up for us." He smiled at Andy. "How you squalled! I never heard such noise." Then he became serious again, and he was explaining something to all of them, something he regarded obviously as highly important. "It worked, you know. Everything worked. Trask came into the church too, and he really got into the swing of things. He put crucifixes in every room, for instance, and free lectures, good ones, to everybody we hired. And salaries. You know, Ned, Baldwin Enterprises gets the best people, absolutely top flight, and we never advertise. We simply ask our people if they know anybody who can do such and such, and would they be interested. And then we pay them exactly twice whatever they say they can make from anyone else, and throw in all the stuff the popes have said about just wages and human dignity and leisure and such. It works. I have the best people in the country working for me, and they work, not because I push or Trask pushes, but because they know they'll get Christian treatment from us, the same sort of thing I got from your father. I imagine Baldwin Enterprises must have close to 20,000 patents by now, and they all either make money or have made money or will make money for Baldwin and for the guy who dreamed the thing up. That's what I got from Ed Bartley. That's why I got so excited when I saw you. More coffee?" Ned sat back with a sigh. He felt completely at ease, entirely at home. "You make me feel like I'm home again," he said simply, and the financier nodded his understanding. At that moment there came a knock and Father Carson limped in, carrying a bright green cloak over his arm. "Ha!" he said. "I see you made it on your own. I suspected you might. Si, this youngster wants to see the spaceship." "This youngster," replied Baldwin, "can go on a trip in the spaceship if he wants to, any time he likes." He grinned. "Go ahead, kids. Take over. I can see you're bursting to show off your knowledge. The rest of us have things to talk over." End of chapter 12. The three young people walked out of a corridor through a door that swung shut behind them and were suddenly in the open air. With the strong, bright sun of early afternoon on their bodies, they headed across the field. After a few hundred feet Nancy stopped and with a smile said, "Look around." Ned looked. Behind him was a hill without the slightest sign of human habitation anywhere, just the waving, foot-high blades of the young growing wheat, exactly the color of the clothes they wore. 100 feet away, against the hillside, they'd be practically invisible. "That way," Andy waved. Ned obediently looked in the direction Andy indicated, but saw nothing except a fairly large hill, part of which had been gnawed away by a great steam shovel, which now stood idle and dusty in the bright sunlight. Near the mechanical monster was a cluster of small prefabricated buildings, with a wisp of smoke trailing idly from the stovepipe chimney atop one of them. From the gnawed-out hillside a perfectly straight road sloped down toward the gate that opened on Route 87, not far from Dumas. "You know," Andy said, his eyes on the gnawed-out hillside, "there are times when I think Steve Westlake's just a little bit too smart to be real." "You mean?" "Yep, that's the hangar and machine shop under that hill. The road's a landing strip. You'd never think it, would you?" "No," Ned agreed. "I never would." "Let's hope," Nancy broke in, her face sober. "Nobody else would either." "Come on." Andy started forward with long swinging strides. The young wheat reached the edge of the scraped out area that indicated where the gnawed out section of the hill had been, and the raw mineral earth was underfoot. Only it wasn't just dirt. It was dun-colored concrete, hard and solid, which felt granite hard through the thin soles of Ned's sandals. Yet it bore all the tooth marks of the great shovel, with gnashes and pebbles, ruts and small stones of every shape, fixed immovably beneath their feet. Then they were at the base of the perpendicular cut, and when Andy reached out and shifted a stone which jutted out, a crack appeared suddenly before them, 6 feet high, just wide enough to admit a man. With his heart pounding, Ned followed Nancy into the dark interior of the hill, hearing the sound of Andy's footsteps behind him. Somewhere a solid, oily click sounded in the complete darkness. Then suddenly, far above them, fluorescent lights thin as spaghetti came to life and shed a cold, bluish radiance upon them. "There she is," Andy said, pride and awe in his voice. "The Santa Maria." Ned looked, and the disappointment must have been plain on his face, because Nancy looked at him and smiled. "It doesn't look the way you thought, Ned, does it?" she said softly. "Not exactly." Ned felt himself blushing. "I know. I was disappointed too," Nancy said quietly. "I thought a spaceship ought to look sort of like a silver bullet with a needle nose and big tail fins standing straight up and pointing to the sky. This thing looks like a sort of overgrown plane, doesn't it?" "That's right," Ned agreed, puzzled. It looks like a big bomber with a long nose. Just a plane, like the ones you see all the time." "Not like this you don't see them all the time," Andy replied. "You think it's familiar because you saw a model of it in my room." "Yeah," Ned breathed. "That's right. On your desk. I remember." "Okay," Andy grinned. "Now that you've had your disappointment, come along and get a close view. This baby has a few surprises for you." They moved toward it. And they walked and walked and walked. Ned realized that the room was so vast that he had not been able to grasp the size of it or of the plane itself. The plane was huge. It was monstrous. The wheels on which it stood were taller than he was. The bottom of the fuselage was easily 30 feet above his head and easily 50 feet in diameter. The leading edge of the vast wings was thicker than he was tall, and the 3 pairs of notulas that hung from each of them were as long as a greyhound bus, and each was easily 8 feet in diameter. The ship looked, he thought, like an ocean liner. How could it ever get off the ground, let alone go hurtling out toward the stars? Andy fiddled with some mechanism in the hub of the wheel. Above them an opening appeared in the vast wing, and a square platform descended smoothly toward them. "Come aboard?" Andy asked, his bright eyes searching Ned's face. "Let old Professor Baldwin show you around and explain the sights? Okay, hang on to me." He touched the button, and the platform rose silently upward, with Andy clinging to the pole to which it was attached, and the others clinging to him. In seconds they were inside the giant machine. "This ship," said Andy with a sort of mock solemnity that gradually ceased to be put on and became real, "is not intended to go shooting out of the atmosphere and come shooting back at full speed. It is meant to fly at a reasonable rate to the highest point at which jet engines can support it, and then take off through the immensely thinner air above that as an acceleration of 1 gravity until it reaches escape velocity and can leave the earth behind." "Goodness sake, Andy," his sister complained. "You sound like somebody at a public meeting." "You ever try explaining it?" Andy demanded. "Big deal." She tossed her head lightly and smiled at Ned, her green eyes aglow with intelligence. "A rocket zooms up at terrific acceleration and then it coasts. That's what they call free fall. Both those things make trouble. First of all, the acceleration is crushing, and in free fall there isn't any gravity, so things just float around. Here on earth when you take a drink, the gravity pulls the water down into your stomach. In free fall you'd have to get the water down by muscle power. You ever try pushing water around?" Ned admitted he hadn't. "It's not easy. This ship takes care of it. We take off at an acceleration of 1 gravity, which means that every second will be going 32 feet a second faster than the previous second. Only instead of coasting, we keep accelerating at 1 gravity until we're halfway to wherever we're going. Then we turn the ship around so that the tail is pointing to the target and use the engine as a brake. That way we decelerate at a force of 1 gravity. It takes us the rest of the trip to slow down to practically a standstill, and when we arrive we're going so slowly that there isn't any re-entry problem. The acceleration and the deceleration take the place of gravity so that everything has weight all the time except during the few minutes it takes to swing the ship around. Clever, isn't it?" She paused and looked at Ned to see whether he understood and was apparently satisfied. "Dad says there's a whole difference of approach. The rockets are weapons, first and foremost. This is first and foremost a ship built for travel and exploration." "Yeah," Andy chimed in eagerly. "That's right. Wait till you see the stuff we have. Air purifiers, water reclaimers, a kitchen, like in a plane. Everything. Name it and we have it. Even an infirmary." He patted the wall beside him. "It's much cozier than a Jupiter." "I suppose so," Ned agreed doubtfully. "It's just that I'm so used to pictures of Vanguards and Jupiters and so on that it just doesn't seem possible." "It is, though," Andy assured him. "Come along. I'll prove it to you. Wait till you see the pictures they took in space during one of the test flights." "You mean it's already been up?" "5 times. No, 6, isn't it, Nan?" "6," she said positively. "This is the corridor on the leading edge of the wings," she explained. "We've got rooms here for 15 passengers on each wing, 30 if they double up. See?" She slid open a narrow door and showed Ned a room about 8 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet high. In the center of the room a hammock-like cot was attached to sturdy rods that ran from floor to ceiling. A series of numbered lockers formed the walls. "See that door in the ceiling?" Ned followed the pointing finger and nodded. "When we're away from Earth under acceleration, the tail of the ship will be down and the nose up because the acceleration takes the place of gravity, you know. So this corridor will be above the rooms because it's along the leading edge of the wing. Up under the top of the wing there's another corridor like this one, only at right angles to us, and that door opens on it, so whoever uses this room won't have to climb up out of it. Beyond these rooms are water tanks, air tanks, and fuel tanks. They're all about this size, but there are more of them. The wing's almost 30 yards wide where we're standing." "Come along to the control room," Andy said eagerly, leading the way. Then he stopped and put his hand on a metal sphere, which Ned judged to be about 8 feet in diameter, and which was crisscrossed by bands of metal, toothed like cogs. "This," Andy stated proudly, "is the heart of the ship. Inside here are 2 big gyroscopes. See those teeth?" "How could I miss them?" "All around this big dome, right under this floor, are cogs, so that we can turn the gyros and point them in any direction." "What for?" Ned asked. "When those gyros are going, they just refuse to move anywhere. They just stay in the same position." "Don't kid me," Ned said. "I know that can't be right. I got a lecture on gyros in school. They tend to move at right angles to the direction of their spin." "Go to the head of the class. So if 2 gyros spin in opposite directions and they're the same size, they cancel out the torque and keep pointing steadily in the same direction, right?" "I suppose so." "2 gyros here, spinning in opposite directions. This dome keeps pointing right where it's aimed, just like a compass. The whole ship can swing around the gyros and aim in any direction. That is what we steer by." Ned nodded, understanding dimly, and they turned left. "Passenger cabin A," announced Nancy. "There's another one beyond the gyros, toward the back. That's the dining room. This one's the social club." "Looks like a passenger plane with a single seat facing the aisle," Ned remarked. "Uh-uh." She shook her head. "Look again. These swivel. The seat will always be down, no matter which way is up. The floor and ceiling will be walls at some time. That's why the floor has those slats in it. Ladder rungs. Bug it?" "Yeah," Ned breathed. "I see. Clever." "And here," Andy slid back a door at the end of the corridor, "is the control room. Watch it. There's a ladder here with 14 steps." He descended and they followed. It was a large room, like the observation car on the end of a train, except 3 times as roomy. There were large windows on all sides, and instruments. Andy pointed to the seats. "Pilot, co-pilot, 2 navigators. These are special chairs. There are moving gym balls. See?" He sat on one and worked some control on the wide armrest. The chair rose smoothly up several feet and swung around until it was in front of one of the windows on the side of the room, facing right instead of forward. "All right," Nancy said a little impatiently. "Now we know you can fly a chair. Where are those pictures?" "Just a minute, I'll get 'em." The chair glided back to its original position, and he scrambled out of it. "Here's the plane controls." He waved at an imposing array of levers and switches. "That's the radio and radar panel." "How come?" Ned asked, struck by a sudden thought, "that this ship's made 6 test flights and nobody's found out about it? I thought they had radar all the time going around to catch unscheduled flights." Andy grinned in delight. "Easy. She absorbs radar waves. They don't bounce. Something about the material she's made of. I can see we have a lot to tell you, boy." Andy opened a cabinet set between 2 windows and brought out a sheaf of large sheets 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. "Take a look. This is what Earth looks like from 300 miles." Ned looked and felt a strange sense of dizziness. There was a portrait of a huge curved section of the earth with mountains and rivers and the ocean in vivid, wonderful color. "And these," said Andy in a sort of reverent whisper, "are the stars." Ned gasped. Against the black velvet background there were uncounted flecks of light, sharp, clear, infinitely varied in color and size and brilliance. It was breathtaking. It was awesome. "Wow," whispered Ned. "Any moment you'd almost expect to see God." And then he knew that all the rest of his life he would want to go out there, where this wonder was. Never again would he be able to look at the stars making outside his window through the leafy tunnel of the tree and be satisfied. As long as he lived he would carry about inside him a restless yearning for this. Reluctantly he put the picture down and turned away. End of chapter 13. Andy started talking again, and Ned forced himself to listen. 3 things had made this whole thing possible, Andy said. One thing was the material of which the ship was built, an unusual alloy of aluminum, gold, and silicone-based plastic, which was ground to powder and mixed into a paste in a colloidal suspension, and then foamed by means of an enormous charge of electricity. Instantly it became rigid, lighter, and stronger than any other metallic substance. The whole vast plane, he said, weighed no more than a jet fighter bomber. The alloy had odd properties too. Its surface, which was a strange pinkish yellow shade, was an almost perfect conductor of heat and electricity in one direction and an almost perfect insulator in the other. If you touched a flame to the surface, you could burn your hand on the same surface 6 feet away inside of 5 seconds. But on the opposite surface, right at the flame, you wouldn't even get warm. This strange conductivity, apparently, was what made the ship invisible to the radar scanners. The ship's skin was made of an 8-inch thickness of the alloy, called jansenism, after the man who invented it. The second invention was a storage battery made of gold isotope sponge, which seemed capable of storing indefinite amounts of electricity and discharging it in enormous quantities on demand. Dad said they had one battery which they've been charging day and night for the last 5 years, with all sorts of gadgets around it to make sure there aren't any leaks. He says there's enough juice in it already to light up the whole city of New York like a Christmas tree every night for a month and run all the subways besides. The third invention was a new fuel for the jet engines, or rather a new additive. "It's a dry liquid," Andy said. "I'll show you when we get back home. I sleep in a tank of the stuff. It's mixed in with kerosene at something like 6 drops to the gallon. The kerosene acts like high octane gas and burns about 4 times as long. Come on, I'll show you the big drive." "The big drive?" Ned repeated wonderingly. "Sure," Nancy told him. "Jet engines are no good in space, you know. This is a rocket ship. We told you she had a lot of surprises." They moved down the long cabin again toward the back of the ship. Some 20 yards along, Andy stooped and pulled up a square section of the floor. "Ladder," he said. 20 steps. Watch it." He disappeared into the darkness of the hole, and a second later the square was aglow with light. His voice came up. "Okay, come along." Carefully Ned descended the metal ladder, counting the rungs, and then looked about him in surprise. He seemed to be inside a gigantic coil spring made of heavy piping instead of wire, a vast tunnel-like structure. Nancy was suddenly beside him, her face wearing an expression of wonder. "I never get used to this," she confided. Andy led the way forward to where a huge metal cube, easily 20 feet on each side, was suspended in the center of the tunnel, braced massively on all sides. As they drew near it, Ned saw that the entire face of the cube was pitted by row upon row of circular depressions, each about 10 inches in diameter. Andy touched something on the side of the cube. With a soft, oily sound, the metal plates that formed the bottom of the depressions slipped aside out of sight and left gaping circular holes. "See those holes?" Andy asked. "They're individual tanks, each holding 5 gallons of propellant. You'll never guess what the propellant is." "I haven't the faintest idea," Ned agreed. "Water. This is the grandfather of all steam engines." "Come on, Andy," Ned protested. "Cut it out." "Fact. You ever let the air out of a balloon?" "Sure." "You know how it starts rushing all around when the air escapes? Well, this thing works on the same principle." Andy pointed at one of the openings and went on eagerly. "The tanks are filled with water, and the water turns to steam at terrific pressure in there. Then the plug opens and the steam comes rushing out just like air out of a balloon, and the engine is pushed away just like the balloon. It takes 2 seconds to escape, and then the next tank opens, and so on. There are 400 tanks, so each one opens up for 2 seconds, roughly every 7 minutes." "Must get awfully hot in here with all that steam," Ned commented. "Oh, no." Andy shook his head emphatically. "This place is full of air now, but when we're in flight this is pumped out, so it's a vacuum. The steam expands like all get out from about 2 cubic feet to about 500,000 inside of 2 seconds. This expansion cools it. And these pipes that you're standing on, they go all around the chamber, and they contain coolant too. So the steam condenses practically instantly, and the water falls down to the tail section and is pumped up again into the engine. We keep using the same propellant over and over. Neat, isn't it? I guess you can call this the world's first self-contained rocket." "But what heats it?" Ned asked. "Electricity. The tanks are lined with tungsten. That's the stuff in light bulbs. Gets white hot almost instantly. That's where the batteries come in. I told you about them." "Well, don't the batteries get discharged?" "We keep charging them. The sun side of the ship gets pretty hot. The other side is cold. You know that sets up an electric current. We store that. And then there are a couple of dozen generators that run on kerosene and bankite. That's the additive I mentioned before. I tell you, Ned, Dad's got a real brain trust working on this thing. They've thought of everything. Fuel, air, water, anything you can mention. Doc Sievers, he's in charge of the actual planning, says this ship can go all the way out to the edge of the solar system and back without the slightest trouble." "Wow," Ned breathed softly. "Wow. What's the first stop?" "Mars. Dad says he wants to explore that first. He says maybe he can get a settlement going there." "But there isn't supposed to be any oxygen on Mars." "I know, but Stevens says that the spectrographs they've been using aren't accurate because our atmosphere filters out many kinds of light. He took spectrographs of Mars during a test flight, and he swears there were spectrum lines in them so much like the ones oxygen makes that he's willing to bet his neck we can breathe Martian air. I guess we'll have to wait and see." "You mean you're going?" Ned asked. "Sure," Andy replied. "Aren't you? You heard what Dad said about going on a trip. He meant it, you know." Ned shook his head, remembering the picture of the stars in space. "My uncle would no more let me go than he'd let me cut off his right arm." "Well," Andy started up the ladder again, "I personally would be very happy to have you along." "So would I," Nancy agreed. "Want to see the rest of the ship?" Ned glanced at his watch. It was almost 5. "I'd love to," he said, "but I'd better be heading home. Supper's at 6:30 in our house, and I don't want to get my uncle more sore than he is." He looked at his new friends. "Maybe I could come back again?" "I'll give you a whistle," Andy told him. "Anytime you want to come back, you blow it and somebody'll pick you up." He hesitated and then grinned. "This sounds awfully funny, I know, but are you sure you couldn't come to Mars with us? We're leaving in about 3 weeks, I think." End of chapter 14. Back in Andy's spare room inside the other hill, Ned changed back into his own clothes, which came out of the enamel cabinet looking as if they had never been worn. Something still puzzled him. "How come," he asked, "that I never hear the sound of Maria take off? You can hear a jet miles away." "Not this one. Somebody figured out a way of putting sound baffles in the rear of the nocellas, just behind the engines. Sound mirrors, I think he called them. They reflect the sound up so that all you get, unless you're above the ship somewhere, is a nice friendly sort of rumble like a lion roaring, if you know what I mean." Andy sat relaxed in his strange looking easy chair, watching as Ned took out his shirt before putting it on. Andy's face wore an expression of undisguised admiration and real friendliness. "Can't you stay a little while longer?" Andy asked, sounding a trifle wistful. "It's nice to have somebody your own age around for a change. The guys are awfully nice, and we have fun horsing around, and we're good friends, but it's nicer when there's somebody your own age. Know what I mean?" "Sure," Ned nodded and reached for his necktie. "Like this afternoon. Steve's swell. And we're practically blood brothers, but he's 26 years old, 10 years older than I am, and he's a heck of a lot bigger and stronger. He's a sort of big brother, you know. They all are. Watch us like a hawk all the time, because Dad's afraid something might happen to me and Nan." His smile suddenly glowed. "I have fun with them, like in the living room before lunch. Steve and I kid around like that a lot, but it is sort of uneven. He lets me win sometimes, but that's sort of hollow. I know he's letting me win. You see what I mean?" "Yeah, Andy," Ned said slowly. "I see what you mean. You're sort of lonesome for a friend your own age." "That's it. That's why I was hoping you'd come on this trip. It would be a real break for me." "I wish I could," Ned said with heartfelt sincerity. "I wish I could." "You can come back though, can't you?" "Can I? Try and keep me away." "Spend a couple of days, maybe?" "I'll try, Andy. Next weekend, maybe. I'll sure try." There was a knock on the door, and at Andy's gay "Advance and be recognized," the door opened and the senior Baldwin came in, followed by the towering figure of Steve Westlake and a thin, wiry little man with strange glasses and a wild shock of gray hair. "Dr. Bliss," the financier said. "This is Ned Bartley. You've heard me speak about his father?" "Ah, yes." An enormous voice, totally unexpected from such a small man, boomed around the room. "So you're Bartley's son, eh? Capital, capital." Ned shook hands with him, aware as he did so that this was the first old person he had seen wearing the bright green clothes that seemed to be a sort of uniform around best. "Don't let my glasses startle you," the man boomed. "They're trifocals, you know. Trifocals. Yes, quite. Yes, indeed. Is there anything about him that would make it impossible for this boy to take the trip to Mars with us? Mr. Baldwin asked. Come here, young man. Let me have your hand. Ned extended it, and the doctor took it in both his own, bent it forward and backward, rubbed the skin near the wrist, and scrutinized the fingernails closely through his strange glasses, all the while giving vent to strange inarticulate sounds in his astonishing voice. He made Ned kneel before him, took Ned's face in his hands, and rubbed delicately with his thumbs along the ridge of Ned's eyebrows and over his cheeks. He pulled down the eyelids, bent Ned's head backward, and felt along his throat with his thumbs, his face all the while only a couple of inches away, his eyes looking like miniature rainbows behind the eye glasses. He moved Ned's head in a complete circle, bending it first to the right, then forward, then to the left, then back again, meantime peering intently into his ears and nostrils. "Humph," he said at last. "Get up, boy, get up. Nothing wrong with you, nothing at all. Of course you've been down with a bad case of flu, obviously. Took care of it, didn't you? Very wise of you. Very wise. Yes. Humph. This time next week you'll be strong as a horse. A horse. Quite. No, Silas, there isn't any reason why he shouldn't go. Nothing physical. Healthiest young animal I've ever seen. Yes, quite." He shook hands with Ned again, harumphed a few more times, and disappeared down the corridor amid strange little sounds. "Takes time." Andy grinned a little, "but Doc always answers the question." "So," Mr. Baldwin smiled at Ned, "Doc says there's nothing physical to keep you back, and he's the best man in the business. You want to come?" "I want to go like anything," Ned replied quickly. "But your guardian, I suppose. Would it help if I talked to him?" "No, sir," Ned answered candidly. "That would make things worse. Ever since the business of the grove of trees, he's hated Bess more than anything else, I think." "Grove of trees?" Baldwin looked puzzled. "What grove of trees?" "Right where that hole was I came through this morning. My Uncle Owen thought he owned the whole grove, and Mr. Kingsley said you had stolen it from him. So he hates you." "Kingsley?" Baldwin's face was suddenly alive with interest. "Forrest Sherlock Kingsley?" Ned nodded. "He's here, in Hillstown?" "Sure," Ned answered. "He's head of the Sons of the Vigilance in Hillstown." Baldwin said thoughtfully. "Is it possible? A tall man, gray hair, smooth face, with a son named Ransom or Hobson or something like that?" "Robson. A bully he is, too." The financier walked over to the desk, his face thoughtful, and stared at the exquisitely detailed model on it for a long moment, absorbed. "Andy, you got a whistle?" "Yes, sir." Andy opened a bureau drawer and unlocked a small metal box. "Right here, number 387. "Let me have it, boy." Baldwin hefted it for a moment, then he picked up the phone and spoke into it. "Harry, activate whistle 387, right now. That's right. Okay?" He put the whistle to his mouth and blew, the strange quivering silence becoming quite noticeable in the room, and listened as the phone made squawking sounds. "Good work. Listed priority A. Fine. Listen, son." Baldwin turned serious eyes on Ned. "Take this. We have a machine here that hears it and pinpoints where it's blowing. I want you to take this. You may not be aware of it, but you are in very serious danger." "Danger?" Ned said blankly, seeing Andy's face suddenly shocked and pale. "I don't understand. What danger?" "Kingsley and Son. They're insane." "Insane?" Ned repeated, and felt like an idiot. He sounded like an echo. "Yes, dangerously insane. Crazy. Homicidal. I know. Listen, son, and try to understand. You know what Jansenium is?" "The stuff the ship's made of?" "That's right." The man went on with a fierce sort of intensity in his voice. "Well, young Jansen, who invented the stuff, went out to celebrate one night in Atlanta and got plastered in some bar. Kingsley picked him up and got enough out of him to realize Jansen had something big. So he kept feeding him drinks and pumping him until Jansen passed out. Next morning Mrs. Jansen called me to ask if I knew where her husband was. He hadn't come home the night before. That was strange, and I had a special interest in the man, so I got detectives busy trying to find him." Baldwin's face was pale with anger at the memory. "They found him all right. We broke into Kingsley's house in the suburbs, and there was Jansen spread eagled on a pool table in the basement, half dead." He swallowed and his voice was carefully controlled. "He was a mess. Kingsley and Son had been working him over for hours. Most sickening thing I ever saw. He stopped and looked at Ned, who felt his stomach contract with nausea. He had a vivid imagination, and Baldwin's voice was so tense with rage and horror that he could all but see the scene. The worst of it was that Jansen had told them everything they wanted to know right off. He said they were wild when he told them that Jansenium was already patented by Baldwin Enterprises, and that's why they had tortured him. He swallowed again. We managed to keep it out of the papers and got the Kingsleys committed quietly. But they both swore I'd never get off the ground with Jansenium. Kingsley said he would destroy me for what I had done, and Robson said he had got even with his mother and he'd get even with me. So you watch out. I don't know how they got out, and it isn't important, but they're insane, so watch out, Ned. If there's any trouble, or even the suspicion of trouble, blow that whistle hard. Is that clear?" "And we'll come running," Andy added. "Right, Steve?" "Sure thing." The big man's face was stern with anger. "All right." Ned nodded and slipped the whistle into his pocket. "Now I'd better be going." "Leave the hole in the fence for Ned to come through," Baldwin told Steve. "But make sure you have people watching all the time. Tell him only Ned is to get to here. I suppose you got his picture?" "Dozens." The big man nodded. "Good. Be careful, son. And any time you want to come, just crawl right through the hole. Somebody'll be there to bring you." He shook hands with the Baldwins and followed Steve along the now familiar route to the garage. As they drove along at a fairly leisurely pace towards Hillstown over the bright green field, the big man turned and looked steadily at Ned, who met his eyes without flinching. "Be nice if you could come along," Steve said quietly. "Big break for Andy and Nancy." "It would be a big break for me, too," Ned answered. "Kingsley's look cross-eyed at you. You blow that thing, hear? Jansen's a good friend of mine. He got me my job here. Took him 3 months to get out of the hospital." Steve's knuckles were white on the wheel, but his voice was soft and level. "Blow and I'll come running, any time, any place." He smiled suddenly, and it made him look very young. "Andy likes you. Cy does too, and Nancy." The Jeep stopped, and Steve reached into the back somewhere and came up with a folded canvas. "Spread this out, and you can get through that fence without getting too dirty." Ned climbed out and took the canvas. "Thanks, Steve." The big man's grip on his hand was firm but gentle, carefully controlled so as not to hurt. "No trouble." Steve looked at him steadily for a moment, then ran his big hand over his closely cropped blond curls. "Don't forget, kid. Blow that thing. Friend of Andy is a friend of mine." He grinned and Ned smiled warmly. "Same here," he said, and the big man nodded. They understood one another. The Jeep roared to life and rolled away. Ned stood watching it until it blended with the green field. Then he turned and started to climb the barren hillock, on the other side of which was the hole. He recalled vividly the big powerful hands, white-knuckled on the wheel. At the memory of Jansen and what the Kingsleys had done. He would not, he decided, as he began to spread the cloth preparatory to sliding under the fence, like to be either one of the Kingsleys. End of chapter 15. There was a car parked outside Owen's house when Ned got home, and he recognized it after a moment. It was Kingsley's big Buick. A swift glance at the garage showed them that Deborah had still not returned from her visit to Amarillo, which meant that one or both Kingsleys were inside with Owen. The thought made him stop. Mr. Baldwin's story of Jansen spread-eagled on a pool table was fresh in his mind, and he did not relish the thought of meeting either Kingsley, especially not if Owen, undoubtedly still angry after the previous night's quarrel, was there too. For a moment he hesitated, then very quickly he moved around the house until he was outside the French door of his own room. It was ajar. Quickly he undid his shoelaces, stepped out of his shoes, and in his stocking feet slipped silently into the room and flitted across it until he was behind the open door that led to the sitting room. His hands were clammy, he realized suddenly, and his heart was pounding furiously. With a detached sort of wonder he realized that he was frightened. Owen and Forrest Sherlock Kingsley were talking in the living room. Their voices were perfectly audible, Kingsley's rich and effortless, Owen's unaccountably thick. The visitor was upbraiding Owen for getting drunk, and Owen was defending himself angrily on the grounds that he was so mad he didn't know what he was doing. "Listen," Owen snapped. "When a man's wife goes back on him and tells him what my wife told me last night, the only thing a man can do is go out and get drunk." He cleared his throat. "I might have killed her otherwise. Oh, my head!" "The Lord is quick to punish," Kingsley said unctuously. "Well, why does the Lord pick on me?" growled Owen. "I didn't do anything. It wasn't my fault. Debbie and the kid, They're the ones the Lord ought to punish." "Deborah is only a weak woman and ignorant," Kingsley replied. "The boy is to blame. He is turning her against you." "Yeah, and the Lord doesn't punish him. Just me." "He expects His servants to do some of the work," answered the other. "The boy's in your charge." "That's right," a third voice said, and Ned recognized it as Robson's. "Ned's your responsibility. You can't expect the Lord to come down and take over when you don't do your job." His voice was edged with a cutting sneer. "What's the matter? You afraid of Ned?" "Afraid of a sniveling bookworm?" Owen snarled, his voice rising in sudden anger. "What are you talking about?" "I don't think you're man enough to give Ned what he deserves," Robson retorted. "If you were, he would be nice and quiet and not go around setting your wife against you." "Why, you " "Stop it," Kingsley's voice commanded. "Be quiet, Rob." His tones were velvety but ice cold. "The boy has something, though, Owen. You have to give him credit for that. Ned should be punished for what happened last night. He should be taught a lesson." "I'll teach him all right," Owen retorted thickly. "I'll tan his hide with a belt. I'll show you. Just you wait." "We'd better be going." Kingsley sounded satisfied and smug. "We'll be late for the meeting." Ned heard them move around. The front door closed, the car doors slammed, and with a roar the big Buick moved away. For a long time he stood there cold and numb. Then a great wave of utter loneliness washed over him. He had the sensation of being abandoned in an utterly empty room, where every door closed slowly and solidly against his going out, leaving him imprisoned and desolate in a darkness from which there was no escape forever. "God help me," he whispered, his voice choked and tears coming suddenly into his eyes. In a paroxysm of grief and desolation, Ned flung himself face down upon the bed and muffled the sound of his fierce weeping on the pillow. After a long time he heard the phone ring and looked around. Night had fallen and the room was in darkness. He could see the outline of the window and the deeper blackness that was the door of the living room. Again the phone rang and he got up and padded out in his stocking feet to answer. It was Owen, talking over a background noise of many voices. Was Deborah back? "No, she's not here." "Did he know where she was?" "She said she was going to Amarillo to spend the day with relatives. She didn't say when she was coming back." The background voices stopped suddenly and Ned knew that Owen had cut the phone. Then, just as he was beginning to think he was wrong, and Owen had actually hung up, the noise came again. "Tell her I won't be home tonight, will you, Ned? At least not till late. This meeting's going on for quite a while." "Yes, sir. I'll tell her as soon as she comes," Ned answered, a sudden chill running up his back. "So long." He hung up slowly. Over the babble of background noises he had heard Robson Kingsley's voice say exultantly, "That's it. Let's go get him." There was the sound of a triumphant laugh, cut off sharply by a "Shh! He'll hear you," enforced Charlotte Kingsley's rich tones. For a moment Ned stood irresolute. Then, moving swiftly, he picked up a sheet of paper from Deborah's desk and wrote on it: "Debbie, Owen says he won't be home tonight, or not until very late. I've gone to spend the night with friends. Ned." Hastily he put the paper on the floor where it couldn't be missed by anyone entering, weighted one end of it with a small brass elephant from the mantelpiece, and went to find his shoes outside the French door. Walt wouldn't mind putting him up for the night without an explanation. Walt was a good friend. Carefully he closed the window and went running swiftly into the darkness. End of chapter 16. (9) The next morning Ned sneaked into his room after Mass and picked up his books, peeking into the living room just long enough to see the note still on the floor where he had placed it. He went to school, where he bought a cup of coffee and a couple of buns in the cafeteria and went hurriedly into Mike's math class, feeling tense and nervous. No matter how hard he tried, his mind kept wandering. In the back of the room he could hear Robson Kingsley moving restlessly about and occasionally making soft snickering sounds that sickened him. He felt trapped. He knew that there would be a next time and that he might not be fortunate enough to get away again. He was aware that since Owen had joined the Sons of the Vigilantes his dislike for Ned had become quite marked. And now, with the Kingsleys at Owen's side to fan up his resentment, Ned knew that Owen's dislike for him had crystallized into a burning hatred, a dreadful, venomous hunger for vengeance over the wrong he was convinced Ned had done him. The previous evening Ned had seen how skillfully and how easily the Kingsleys had managed to convince Owen that Ned was to blame for the bitter quarrel with Deborah, and the memory of their insane cruelty in Atlanta made him almost sick with anxiety. They were stalking him as they would an animal. Robson's snickers had a note of gleeful anticipation, as if he were absolutely sure that no matter how Ned turned and twisted they would eventually get him, and then... Mike was talking about vectors and illustrating his point by examples taken from a billiard carom, two balls coming from different directions, hitting a third ball which moved in a third direction. He tried to follow, but his imagination got in the way. Spread eagled on a pool table. There was a dreadful finality about the phrase, a sort of stark description of utter helplessness. It was chilling to think of someone deliberately made unable to lift a finger in his own defense. It was nauseating to visualize a man tied down that way and deliberately made to suffer. Ned shook his head to drive away the mental picture of it, and tried to concentrate on what Mike was saying. But again the small sounds of Robson Kingsley were loud enough to drown out Mike's strong voice. What kind of mind, he wondered, could deliberately plan to spread eagle a man and torture him? "They're insane." Baldwin's earnest voice came back into his mind. "Dangerously insane." For a moment he visualized Robson, a gloating look on his handsome face, licking his lips with excitement as he watched a man writhe and squirm helplessly before him. Ned had seen a similar expression of satisfaction on young Kingsley's face the day Robson had knocked Walter Drew down in the gym. And now Robson was in the back of the room, looking at him, he was certain, with the same gloating expression on his face. "They're insane." The memory of Baldwin's words sent a cold, sickening chill up his back. He was afraid. He was terribly afraid. With an effort he forced himself to think. He had to think, he realized, coolly and logically, otherwise he would never find a way out. Mike's voice droned on, unheard, and slowly, carefully, Ned laid his plans. Deborah was not home at lunchtime. At least the phone rang and rang without her answering. That meant that he could take no chances going home. With Deborah around, it was not likely that Owen or the Kingsleys would do anything. They had to catch him alone. He forced himself to swallow a tasteless sandwich and a glass of milk. He couldn't afford not to eat. "Would you mind if I spent the night with you?" Ned asked Mike, who looked astonished at the request. "Debbie is away somewhere, and I don't want to be alone with my uncle. He keeps arguing all the time, and I can't get any work done." It sounded thin and implausible. "Please, Mike," he said desperately, and then added with an enormous effort, "I'm afraid of him." Mike looked at him steadily for a long moment, his face expressionless. Then he reached out an affectionate hand and mussed Ned's hair with a gruff friendliness. "Why, you poor kid," he said. "You're terrified. Sure you can come in with me. Only I warn you, you won't be comfortable, and you'll have to put in a few hours of work in the library tonight. I promised Amanda I'd help her catalog some new books." "That's swell, Mike," Ned said with heartfelt relief. "Thanks." "Want to talk about it, kid?" "Not here," Ned said. "Okay, get into a pair of trunks and let's wrestle." With a light heart Ned walked into the locker room to change. Robson Kingsley was there, carefully folding a pair of shorts before putting them in his locker. Ned caught his breath, then pulled himself together and went in. Robson alone was not the problem. It was in combination with his father and Owen that he was to be dreaded. "You hanging around long?" Robson asked softly, his tongue running quickly over his parted lips. "Not long," Ned said in what he hoped was a light tone. "Why?" "Just asking." Robson shrugged elaborately and stretched. "Guess I'll swim." He started toward the door of the pool. "Take it easy," Ned called after him, "and don't wait for me. I'm going out with the coach." Robson shrugged again and disappeared on his way to the pool. Thoughtfully Ned put on his shorts and gym shoes and went to look for Mike. He was safe for the moment. Tomorrow would be another day. Maybe, he thought with sudden eagerness, he could go over to the Baldwins. Steve would be a comforting sight. He grinned, suddenly remembered the scene in the big pleasant room where Andy had wrestled with the big man. The room, he realized, had been warm with love, filled with the rich laughter of affection. Mr. Baldwin's smile as he watched his son stand abashed on tottering legs had held no mockery. And his huge explosion of laughter at Andy's exit line had been, actually, a shout of triumphant glee at his son's quickness of mind. Carefully Ned laced his shoes and turned his mind to the immediate present. He had to practice wrestling with Mike. It would be a rough session, but it would have about it the healthy atmosphere of Baldwin's room and none of the sickening horror of Atlanta. End of chapter 17. Mike Pewkin lived in a small house on Cottonwood Street, which was, as he smilingly said, on the wrong side of the tracks. The house consisted of one fairly large room, a small kitchen, and a tiny bath. It was furnished simply: a sofa which opened up into a double bed, a studio couch, a worn desk on which were neat little piles of paper and a telephone, and two comfortable chairs matching the sofa. There were bookshelves between the windows on both sides of the room, and a small radio. The kitchen was a marvel of compactness, immaculately clean, and in the little hallway that led to the bathroom there was a bureau for storing what did not fit in the closet. The whole thing was tidy and spotless, and Ned found it very friendly. They talked in the kitchen as they ate the excellent meal of steak and potatoes that Mike prepared, with a minimum of fuss. The coach listened with an intent expression as Ned told him about the quarrel, the trip to Baldwin's compound, and its aftermath. He asked pointed questions, and examined with great care the porcelain whistle which Ned showed him. When the boy, his voice slightly steady with emotion, told him what Baldwin had said about the Kingsleys, and why he had said it, his face became stern, and his lips pursed in a long, silent whistle. "I wish I knew what to tell you, Ned," he said quietly. "Owen is your guardian, and he hasn't abused you. The only thing you can do is alert Police Chief Drew and ask him to keep an eye out. Chances are the Kingsleys are out legally. They wouldn't dare show up here otherwise. The other thing is to make sure that you're alone as little as possible. I don't think they're foolish enough to try anything before witnesses. You have a good lock on your door, don't you?" "I suppose so," Ned answered. "I never tried it." "Maybe Walt's father can think of something. We can try him tomorrow. Now how about cleaning up here while I freshen up? I don't want to see Amanda looking like an unwashed coal heaver." Ned found it pleasant enough in the library. He sat at one table, pasting card pockets into books and copying numbers from a typed list to the flyleaves with an indelible pencil sharpened to a fine point. At another table across the room Mike and Miss Deeb sat with their heads close together, talking in low tones as they worked, their hands occasionally touching, and the books going unmarked for long periods as they became immersed in their conversation. Amanda Deeb was about 25 or so, with a friendly face that was liberally sprinkled with freckles, and a soft, throaty voice that Ned found musical and Mike obviously found completely enchanting. Occasionally borrowers would drop in, and Miss Deeb would come hurrying to the reception desk, blushing at the understanding smiles they bestowed on her. A couple of them spoke to Ned, and one old man with swarthy skin, bald head, and a luxuriant white mustache engaged Mike and the librarian in extended and obviously very courtly conversation. Ned recognized him. He was Don Francisco Jose Maria de Tovar y Tovar, who owned and operated a large and highly successful flower business with the help of 3 grown grandsons. Ned had been through the hothouses once, and the old man had treated him like a prized customer instead of someone sent to pick up flowers for the altar. The florist was in subdued high spirits this evening. His youngest grandson, Miguel, was about to become a father for the first time. "I am too excited to wait at home," the old man said, "and I would not want to make myself obnoxious at the hospital." It was about 11 when Mike and Ned finally returned to the little house on Cottonwood Street, after having escorted Miss Deeb to her home. There Ned discreetly waited at the neat picket fence, while Mike disappeared with his companion in the shadows of the porch, and reappeared after a few minutes, his feet doing an unconscious little dance on the cement walk. "Better wipe Miss Deeb off your face," Ned said dryly as they entered Mike's house and put on the lights. "That color looks better on her mouth than it does on yours." Mike grinned and wiped his lips with a handkerchief, looking at the bright red smear on the white cloth and shaking his head slightly at the sight. "Tastes much better than it looks." He folded the handkerchief again and put it carefully back in his pocket. He reached out and ruffled Ned's hair affectionately. "You might as well know it before you worm it out of me. She said yes. How about that? Miss Amanda Pewkin. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it?" "Sure does," Ned said, squeezing the other's strong square hand in both his own. "Sure sounds wonderful, Mike. Congratulations." "Thanks, kid." His face became serious again, and he ruffled Ned's hair a second time. "You look beat. Why don't you wash up while I get this monster open for you? Towels on the top drawer of the bureau, pajamas in the third. Hop to it." Mike was already bedded down on the couch when Ned came into the room wearing a pair of spectacularly colored pajamas he had found in the drawer. Unexpectedly there was a knock on the door. "You get it," Mike grinned. "Even in those screaming eagles, you look more respectable than I would in a pair of shorts." There was a policeman at the door, a tall, tired-looking man with a worried look on his face. Ned recognized him. His name was Jerry Welch, and he was a friendly sort, always ready to spend a minute chatting with the students on their way to and from school. He looked surprised to see Ned, and then his expression of worry deepened. "Hi, Jerry." Mike waved a friendly hand from the bed. "What brings you around at this time? Somebody rob a bank?" "Somebody tried," the officer said grimly. "What?" Mike sat up abruptly, visibly shocked. "You serious? When?" "Somebody tried," the officer repeated grimly. "It didn't quite work. But the Chief was shot. He's in the hospital now with 3 bullets in him." "That's terrible. No wonder you look like a wreck." Mike was out of bed in an instant, padding around the floor toward the kitchen. "Sit down, Jerry. I'll get you some coffee." "This isn't a social call, Mike," the policeman said. "Wait a minute." Mike's face was incredulous. "You mean you think that I'm mixed up in this?" "Please, Mike." The tall man held up his hand placatingly. "Don't blow a gasket. We've been friends too long for that. Sit down and listen." "All right." Mike sat on the edge of the bed. "Shoot." "Can you prove you weren't near the bank tonight about 10?" "Sure I can. Ned here was with me all night. He can tell you." "That's not good enough." The other shook his head. "He's going to have to prove he wasn't there either." "Jerry, what's going on here, anyway?" "Please, Mike, answer my question. I don't like to do this. You know that. I owe you a lot." "Okay, okay. I'll be patient. Ned and I spent the evening in the library working. Miss Deeb will back that up. So will Mr. Tovar and Miss Brewster and Steve Dobson and a lot of other people who saw us there. We didn't leave until about 10:30. Relief wiped away the concern on the officer's face, and he smiled. "I knew it," he said. "I was sure of it. How about that coffee?" "Okay. About 15 minutes ago, young Kingsley and a couple of his friends walked into headquarters and said they saw you two and Miguel Tovar running away from the bank right after the shooting." "Miguel Tovar?" Ned put in. "That's silly. He was at the hospital waiting for his baby to be born." "You sure?" the officer demanded. "That's what his grandfather said," Mike assured him. "It's Miguel's first baby. He's been with his wife there since 5 this afternoon." "Why do you suppose those kids came up with the story? Doesn't make sense." "Yes, it does," Mike said slowly. "Owen and the Kingsleys have been trying to get Ned alone for a couple of days now. Ned told Rob he was going to be with me. If we're arrested, it would be easy for Owen to come around to the jail and take Ned home. He can't very well do it here without reckoning with me. It does make sense in a crazy sort of way." "What are they trying to get him alone for?" the policeman wanted to know. "Give him a beating," Mike said laconically. "Which he doesn't deserve." "Makes sense," the policeman nodded. "But what about young Tovar?" "That's easy. Kingsley's men have been gunning for the foreigners. Mexicans seen near the place of the crime. Nice headline, wouldn't it be? Besides, the old señor tossed out a couple of Rob's pals one day when they came around his hothouse." The officer nodded thoughtfully, then grinned. "I got an idea. How about that coffee?" Mike nodded and padded into the kitchen. "Use your phone?" "Help yourself." Mike's voice rose above the sound of running water and clashing pans. Ned watched. The tall man picked up the phone and asked for headquarters. Then he winked at Ned and spoke into the mouthpiece, very clearly. "Sarge? Welch here. I thought you'd like to know that Buick and Bartley and Tovar all have ironclad alibis. Those kids are lying." He listened, nodding a couple of times, and added, "Absolutely positive. There's no mistake." He pulled the instrument away, and Ned heard the angry sputtering at the other end. "Sure, they ought to be kicked. How about just holding them as material witnesses? They said they were at the scene and saw the criminals. A night in jail might do 'em good." He listened, his face widening into a smile of satisfaction, and then he slowly hung up. "Hurry up with that Java, Mike," he called. "I got a wife waiting at home for her wandering boy." "Come in here," Mike called. "What do you think I am, a butler?" "You know," Welch said, "you still make the worst coffee in town, except for my wife. I can hardly wait to see the paper in the morning." "Why?" "Kingsley's bought into it. Wonder how they'll get around Rob Kingsley spending a night in jail." "Serves the brat right," Mike declared. "But I'm not so sure it's smart. I got a feeling about Kingsley, and it isn't good. The man's not sane, I'm sure of that. He's crazy and he's smart. That makes him very dangerous." He yawned. "Have you no home? I've got class to teach tomorrow." The officers shook hands and departed. Mike rinsed out the cups and put them away, chatting all the while about how he and Jerry had flown together in Korea and cemented a lasting friendship by pulling each other out of dangerous spots. Ned listened, hardly able to keep his eyes open, and grinned when Mike told him to hit the sack without waiting for him. But once in bed he could not sleep. He listened to Mike's final bit of house cleaning and watched him as he padded around on his bare feet, deftly restoring things to their proper place. His movements, Ned thought, were like the man himself, swift and sure and purposeful. "He's like a rock," Ned thought, "solid and strong. I'd like to be like that." Oddly, Mike reminded him of Steve Westlake. Both men had the same quality of strength and dependability. Finally Mike slipped under the covers and switched off the lamp. For a long time Ned lay quietly on his back in his borrowed pajamas, his hands lying loosely at his sides. "Mike," he called softly. "What is it, kid?" The voice was sleepy. "Mike, when I was a kid, I used to hear my father and mother sometimes when they went to bed. They used to pray together aloud. Would you pray aloud with me, Mike?" For a moment there was silence. Ned could almost feel Mike's eyes turning his way. Then gravely the man recited the first half of the Our Father and the first half of the Hail Mary, waiting for Ned to finish each. When they had finished, Mike sighed with satisfaction. "Pleasant dreams, Buster," he said quietly. "And don't worry. I'll drive you to church in the morning. I have a lot to be thankful for, too." Next morning the paper carried the story about the attempted bank robbery and the shooting of Police Chief Emmett Drew. It also carried a boxed editorial on the front page, indignantly criticizing the police for their inefficiency in not being able to prevent the crime, and denouncing the barbarous behavior of the whole department in forcing 3 respectable young citizens who had volunteered information to spend the night in jail like common criminals. Buried in the back pages was the information that a son had been born the previous evening to Mr. and Mrs. Miguel de Tovar y Tovar, and that the father was bringing suit against Robson Kingsley and his father for defamation of character, slander, and criminal libel for the sum of $1,000,000. End of chapter 18. (7) Deborah came back that afternoon looking pale and withdrawn, and Ned felt it safe to return home. Owen glared unforgivingly at his wife and informed her that he was going to be very busy the next few days and he would probably not be home. He was, he said, staying with the Kingsleys. They were busy organizing the work of the Sons of the Vigilantes. From what the papers reported 3 days later, the Sons wanted a shake-up in the police department. Kingsley and other distinguished citizens, Owen was one of them, had taken the bank robbery seriously. The police, they said, were unable to cope with either the major crimes or the minor nuisances committed by Hillstown delinquents. It was high time something was done. They had organized a citizens' committee and were asking the mayor to appoint Mr. Kingsley temporary chief of police during the incapacity of Mr. Drew. There was a picture of Kingsley looking stern and dignified, and a picture of a group of grim-looking citizens, with Owen in the midst of them. Significantly, there was no mention of the incident at the police station when Robson's identification had backfired. Ned read the article with a strange, empty feeling inside him. Kingsley's harangues to the Sons, faithfully reflected in the actions and words of his followers, gave a clear indication that there was a strong anti-foreigner drive on. The paper carried a small item stating that somebody had thrown bricks into the Tovar hothouses, doing considerable damage to the buildings and injuring a workman who was cut by flying glass. The police had no information either as to the identity of the vandals, nor their reason, and the paper concluded it was malicious mischief on the part of some excitement-hungry teenagers. A number of similar things had happened all over town, nothing really serious, just broken windows, damaged books, torn curtains. In every instance the victims had been Mexicans or Jews. The Sons of the Vigilantes, Ned knew, were on the march. Owen came home smiling triumphantly that night. The mayor had appointed Kingsley temporary chief of police. Robson had not put in an appearance in school since the incident of the police station, but the morning after his father's appointment he showed up again, his handsome face wearing a smug expression, and asked all sorts of questions in every class except Mike's. The coach ignored him completely. Ned admired the man's iron self-control. Ned himself could not help but be aware of the other boy's disturbing presence, and he found it distracting. It was no longer necessary to keep from thinking about Baldwin's story. He found, to his own surprise, that he was accepting Robson's insanity as a part of him, like his eyes or mouth. It was just something he had to watch, that was all. So he watched it, resolved not to get mixed up with the other boy if he could possibly avoid it. As it happened, he wasn't able to avoid it. Walter had come to class that day for the first time since his father had been shot. He looked thin and drawn, and Ned's heart went out to him in sympathy. They had a brief lunch together, and then they went out for a short stroll along the edge of the cinder track before going back to class. "My father's better," Walt said. "The doctors say he has a good chance to pull through. He recognized me last night." He looked away and suddenly shouted, "Look out!" and pushed Ned aside. A baseball whizzed past them. "So sorry," Robson Kingsley said. "You threw that deliberately," Walter accused. "You crazy or something?" Kingsley was suddenly standing before them, his face livid. "Don't you ever say that again," he hissed. "Nobody in his right mind deliberately throws a baseball at somebody's head," Walter stated positively. "You must be crazy." With a wild animal howl of rage, Robson hurled himself at Walter. Before Ned could move, the crippled boy was flat on his back on the ground, with young Kingsley sitting on his stomach and banging the other's head on the ground. Ned recovered swiftly, seized the raging boy's jacket, and flung him aside with a powerful heave. Then before he could bend down to see how his friend was, Robson was on him. The fury of the attack drove Ned back in momentary confusion, dazed by the blows that rained on him. Then he reacted swiftly and began defending himself with all the strength and skill at his command. Robson's fury lent him an astonishing strength, but it also deprived him of the coolness he needed to overpower his adversary. Ned was strong, and under Mike's careful coaching he had become a skillful boxer. For a few minutes he defended himself out of the need to do so, his only thought being self-protection. Then, as they struggled, Ned was suddenly filled with an icy rage at his assailant. Kingsley had persecuted and maligned him. Kingsley had attacked his friend and had assaulted him without cause. He wanted to smash the other, to batter his handsome face to a bleeding pulp, to reduce him to a helpless and quivering hulk. Adroitly he sidestepped a furious rush, ducking under Robson's wild swing, and landed 2 heavy blows on Kingsley's body. 3 times he avoided the other's charge, each time driving his fist deep into the other's midsection. The 4th charge was slower. As the blows took their toll, and Ned stepped inside and shot out a left fist that caught the other full on the mouth and snapped his head back. Before Robson could recover, Ned swung with all his strength, and his right hand caught the other at the pit of his stomach, driving out his wind with an explosive whoosh. Robson's eyes glazed, his mouth opened, and his arms were suddenly hanging helpless at his sides as his knees began to buckle. Before he could fall, Ned seized him by the white jacket he wore and shook him furiously, like a terrier shaking a rat. Kingsley's head jerked back and forth limply for a few moments, then his neck stiffened as he managed to catch his breath again. Keeping his grip with his left hand, Ned brought his right hand back and slapped him with his open hand across the face again and again, a dozen times before pushing him away in sudden loathing and allowing him to fall on the ground in a heap, breath coming in great gasps, blood trickling from his mouth, his tear-streaked face bearing the angry red marks of Ned's open hand. Ned's anger drained away and turned to disgust. He felt unclean. Walter was getting groggily to his feet, helped by a couple of schoolmates who had come running at the sound of the fight. It had not, Ned realized with a shock, lasted more than a couple of minutes, if that. "You all right?" he asked Walter. The other boy nodded. "My head aches, that's all." "Maybe you ought to go home," one of the boys suggested. "No, I'm all right," decided Walter. "I'll make it, don't worry." "Boy, that was some fight," the same boy said, looking at Ned with admiring eyes. "You see the whole thing?" "Right from the time he threw the ball at you." "Come on then," Ned said. "We're going right into Mr. Allen and tell him the whole thing. You be a witness." He stepped to where Kingsley still lay on the ground, sobbing. "You get up here. You're coming with me." The 4 of them marched into the principal's office and laid the story out before him, with the 3 of them accusing Kingsley. Mr. Allen's eyes were cold. "You get your books and go home. Don't come back," he said to Robson. "We don't want your kind around here. And don't bring your father, either. It won't do any good. You are through." Then he turned to Walt and Ned, and his eyes were still frosty. "You 2 know what the regulations are about fighting. You're suspended for 2 days. Now get out, all of you." "Suspended?" Ned asked in astonishment. "Suspended," the principal repeated. "For 2 days. Go home, both of you. And don't show up around here again till the day after tomorrow. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Walter nodded, nudging Ned in the ribs with his elbow. "Come on, Brain. Thank you, sir." Ned's hands were sore, the knuckles of his left hand were skinned, and the fingers of his right hand swollen. His left shoulder and his right side ached, and his mouth felt puffy. He had by no means escaped unscathed from the battle. Walt looked at him and grinned a little. "You better come along to my house and do something about your face," he said. "I have a first aid kit." Ned stayed at Walter's house until it was time for school to be dismissed. Walt was going to see his father in the hospital. He said there was no point in telling him about the suspension. "Personally, I think old Allen was just giving us a couple of days off as a reward for giving him a reason to get Kingsley out of the school," Walt said, nodding sagely. "What are you going to tell your folks?" "Just what happened," Ned shrugged. "Things in my place can't get much worse. My uncle's been planning to give me a licking for so long I've more or less become used to the idea. Maybe this'll give him a chance to get it over with. Does it look bad?" "Be my guest," Walt said, waving toward a mirror. There was a purplish swelling at the left corner of Ned's mouth and an ugly looking scrape high on his right cheekbone. "You've been in a fight and anybody will know it by looking at you," Walt continued. When Walter left for the hospital, Ned started home. The first thing he saw when he entered was Owen sitting on an easy chair, obviously waiting for him. "So," his uncle said grimly, "the prodigal returns. Have a good day at school?" "I got suspended." Ned took the plunge. There was no point in postponing things any longer. "For fighting. Kingsley got expelled." "Just like that, huh? I suppose he started it." "He started it," Ned nodded. "He knocked Walt down and I pulled him off, so he jumped me." "I suppose you know that Kingsley is the most important man in town?" "That doesn't give Rob any right to." "That gives Rob the right to do anything he likes," snapped Owen. "Can't you understand? Kingsley's the most important man in town." "Rob Kingsley started it," Ned said flatly. "He threw a baseball at me, and he was banging Walt's head against the ground. He would have killed him if I hadn't pulled him off. I don't care how important his father is." "Well, I care," Owen said, rising to his feet, his hand on his belt buckle. "And you're going to care too. I'm going to teach you. Get out to the barn. You're going to get a lesson you'll never forget. I am sick and tired of your high and mighty ways." Ned felt the blood drain from his face and his hands were suddenly clammy. But he managed to keep his voice steady as he looked Owen in the face and said, "Yes, sir." He would not utter a single sound, he resolved grimly, no matter what Owen did, and he would not raise a finger in his own defense. The doorbell rang and Owen went to the door with quick strides and flung it open. Forrest Sherlock Kingsley and his son walked in. Robson's face was a mess. His mouth was swollen, there was an angry bruise on the left side of his jaw near the chin, and his right eye was a stupendous shiner, purple, green, and blue. There could be no doubt who had come out second best in the fight. Owen's jaw sagged at the sight, and the look he shot Ned was venomous. The senior Kingsley's face was stony. "Well, Owen," he said without preamble, "take a good look at what that nephew of yours did to my son." He glared at Ned, his eyes smoky with fury. "You satisfied?" "He started it," Ned repeated. "All I did was defend myself." "Robson," Kingsley said icily, "does not go around picking fights." Deborah, attracted by the sound of the doorbell, came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Since her return from Amarillo she had been a changed person. She no longer seemed to be afraid of mice. "Robson picked this one," Ned said with determination. "You calling me a liar, boy?" "All I'm saying is I didn't start it," Ned replied. "Walt Drew started it," Rob said unexpectedly. "You're crazy," Ned shot back, and then took a step backward at the sight of Robson's sudden frightful expression. "You are crazy. Mr. Baldwin was right." Forrest Kingsley put a hand on his son's shoulder and Robson became suddenly calm. "Baldwin?" Kingsley Sr. said. "Where did you meet Baldwin?" He turned to Owen. "He's been in the Best compound, Owen. He knows what they're doing there. Look at his face." He stepped forward suddenly and gripped Ned's shirt. "They're going soon, aren't they? Aren't they?" His face was a mask of fury. "Answer me." "Yes," Ned nodded, taken aback by the other's rage. "When? When?" "I don't know." Ned wet his lips. "You're lying. He's lying, Owen. He does know. You've got to make him tell, understand? Look at him. He knows all right." "Tell him," Owen said. "I don't know." "Tell him or I'll get it out of you with a strap." "We'll help, won't we, Dad?" Robson put in. "I tell you I don't know," Ned said desperately. "All right," Owen decided grimly. "Go out to the barn." Kingsley released Ned, his face triumphant, and stepped back beside his son. Ned smoothed out the front of his jacket with cold, unsteady fingers. He was almost paralyzed with terror. Jansen's ordeal was once again blotting everything else out of his mind. Then Deborah spoke. She was standing by the fireplace, her hands behind her back. "Just a minute," she said quietly, and they all turned and looked at her. "Mr. Kingsley," her voice was flat and level, "this is my house. I bought it with my money, and it's in my name." The abrupt change of subject caught them all by surprise, kept them staring at her. "We were nice and peaceful here till you came," Deborah went on implacably. "And since then we've had nothing but commotions and arguments. So I'm asking you and your son to leave my house and not come back. I won't have you coming around here trying to get Owen to punish the boy. It's hard enough to keep the peace without you." For a second Kingsley stared incredulously. Then he threw back his head and laughed. Deborah brought her hands around, and Ned saw that she had a double-barreled shotgun, and it pointed straight and steadily at the laughing man. He saw it too, and the laugh suddenly died in his throat. "I'm the Chief of Police," he sputtered. "And this is my house," she retorted without raising her voice. "Get! I warn you, either you leave, now, or I'll fill you and your precious son full of buckshot. Move." "She'll do it too," Ned thought. Kingsley apparently decided the same thing. Followed by the open barrels of the gun, he and his son opened the door and went outside. A moment later the car door slammed, and the sound of the powerful motor faded. "And don't come back," Deborah said, to no one in particular. Her eyes on Owen were filled with pity and contempt. "You're the boy's guardian, Owen. If he does something wrong, you can correct him. But if you lay a hand on him, you can move right out of my house. I talked to a lawyer in Amarillo, and I know my rights." She paused. "I'm not afraid of you any more." Their eyes clashed. Owen's angry and uncertain, Deborah's cold, implacable. After a moment the man dropped his glance and turned to Ned, his face pale with humiliation and chagrin. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You've turned her against me. I could break your neck." He controlled himself with a violent effort and rubbed his lips angrily with the back of his hand. "You're not to see or speak to Mike Pugh again outside of class at any time for any reason, and you're never to go back into the best compound again. Is that clear? Not for any reason." "Yes, sir," Ned said steadily, meeting his uncle's eyes. "That's clear." "All right." Deborah carefully hung the shotgun back on its braces next to the fireplace and wiped her hands on her apron. "You men better get cleaned up. Supper's almost ready." Without a look at either of them, she went calmly out to the kitchen. End of chapter 19. (6) Ned found it excruciatingly painful to face Mike when he returned to school after his suspension. During his time at Hillstown, Ned had grown very close to the teacher coach who had been so generous with his time and his attention toward him. Mike, he realized, was an extraordinary person. He was an excellent teacher and a fine coach. But more than that, he was a fine friend who took genuine pleasure in the contacts he had with his students outside of class. He was by all odds the most popular teacher in Hillstown, and yet everybody knew and took for granted that friendship with him outside of class would never influence his behavior in class. In fact, a student who had spent time socially with him, he was a welcome guest at many homes, was always careful to prepare especially well for Mike's class the next morning, as he was almost certain to be called on. Mike's friends among the students knew that they could not count on that friendship to secure any advantage in class. Mike had no teacher's pets, and everybody knew it. He was unfailingly courteous, patient, and absolutely impartial. It was in all likelihood because of this that nobody in the school ever attributed to Ned, Walter, and other friends of the coach any ulterior motive. Mike, they knew, would have no truck with apple polishing. So Ned found it very difficult to tell Mike. He never seriously entertained the thought of defying his uncle in the matter. Father Bolton had explained some time ago that a guardian has the same authority as a parent, and Ned was therefore bound to obey Owen. So he waited until the small group that always surrounded Mike after class melted away, and then he told him. "Uncle Owen has given me orders not to see you or speak to you outside of class," he said, his face hot and flushed. Mike was silent. Ned looked up and saw that his face was bleak with anger. Then the teacher put his hand on Ned's shoulder and squeezed it gently. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Mind telling me why?" "He was mad at me for fighting with Rob Kingsley, and I guess he figures not seeing you outside of class will hurt. I don't know, Mike. I get confused every time I try to figure out why. It's just a punishment, that's all, I think." "It's all right, Ned," Mike said softly. "I understand." Then he grinned slowly. "Outside of class, is it? Well, any time you feel the need of extra class, say the word. Now maybe you'd better go home. Don't hang around the gym any more after school. Your uncle will probably check, and there's no use giving him reason to think you're disobeying him. And don't worry, Ned. I understand." They shook hands and Ned left, feeling much better. Mike was right. Owen was at the house when Ned arrived, busy washing the car. He looked, Ned thought, somewhat nonplussed at his arrival, as if surprised and slightly disappointed because Ned had done what he had been told. Feeling a little lost, Ned went into his room, turned on the radio, and opened a book at random. This was the first time in months that he had not had something strenuous and exciting to do after class. He realized for the first time how largely Mike, as athletic director, loomed in his life. The radio, to which Ned hardly ever listened, was tuned to the local station and was playing a plaintive ballad about a cowboy who sought his true love through endless verses, to the accompaniment of a twanging guitar. After a few minutes the sad music got on his nerves, and he was reaching out to change the station when the song ended. An announcer, with a somewhat adenoidal voice, informed the world that there would be a town meeting the following evening at the Hillstown High School Gymnasium. His Honor the Mayor would preside, and, as vital subjects were to be discussed, all were urged to be there promptly at 8 o'clock. Ned decided to take a shower and go for a walk. He had a couple of books that had to go back to the library, and maybe he could drop in at the hospital and chat a while with Mr. Drew, who was now well enough to have visitors. Mostly, he simply wanted to stretch his legs and get rid of some of the energy he usually worked off in the gym. Miss Deeb was not there. It was her day off. Her replacement, Mrs. Harlow, was a thin-lipped woman who disapproved sternly of all conversation in the library, even by and with the librarian, so Ned simply returned the books and went on. At the hospital he was informed that Mr. Drew was asleep and was not to be disturbed. He wrote a brief note and left, to wander aimlessly up one street and down another, nodding now and then to people he knew, stopping a couple of times to watch groups of youngsters at their play. Finally he found himself in the grove, and walked over to the hole in the fence. As he was examining it, he heard a sound and turned to find Robson Kingsley watching him. "So," Kingsley said, "that's how you got in." "That's how," Ned nodded. "And now you can't go in any more, can you?" Robson crowed. "You're a good obedient little boy, and your uncle said to stay out, didn't he?" Ned found the mockery in his tone highly offensive, but he merely shrugged and said nothing. "Well," Robson informed him, "I'm going in." "Why tell me?" Ned shrugged again. "I don't care what you do." "I'll tell you why," Robson said. "Because I know they're building a spaceship, and I'm going to wreck it. That's why." "Sure," Ned replied. "You're going to wreck it. Tear it apart with your own little white hands and scatter the pieces, I suppose." Robson's face suddenly had a sly look on it. "Oh, I can wreck it. Don't you worry about that." "I'll lie awake all night," Ned said ironically. "All right, wise guy. All right. You'll find out." He stepped into the gully, pulled himself up on the other side of the fence, and leered at Ned. "You'll find out." He turned his back and started scrambling up the hill. Ned watched him through the fence, feeling an odd sense of uneasiness. Robson was insane, and he sounded perfectly sure of his ability to wreck the ship. What if a bold unexpected move, without apparent logic, would enable him to do it? Ned decided not to take a chance. Without a moment's hesitation he pulled the white porcelain whistle out of his pocket, put it to his lips, and blew. The strange, silent vibration made his head ring. Robson disappeared over the crest of the hill, and Ned waited, wondering. Suppose they didn't hear? Suppose Robson eluded the green-clad guards and somehow managed to damage the Santa Maria? Suppose He waited in an agony of suspense for what seemed hours. From nowhere on the other side of the hill he heard voices. Then there came the sound of an approaching jeep, engine racing furiously. Robson's voice rose in a wild howl, and there were shouts, cries of warning, and a roar of rage. Ned waited, fingers gripping the steel mesh of the fence, ears straining to catch and interpret the noises from beyond the hill. Suddenly Robson appeared, running as if his life depended on it, his face white with terror. Behind him loomed the huge, familiar figure of Steve, catching up fast. Robson flung himself recklessly down the hill, stumbling and rolling head over heels into the gully. Miraculously, he didn't seem to be hurt. With the agility of a cat he scrambled toward the hole in the fence and was halfway through it when the big hand closed around his ankle. Furiously, Robson lashed out with his other foot. His heavy shoe caught Steve across the knuckles so that the grip relaxed. That was all Robson needed. With agility born of terror, he hurled himself forward under the fence. The ends of the steel mesh caught on his trousers, there was a loud ripping sound, and Robson was on his feet, racing away. Steve stood up on the other side of the metal barrier, rubbing his bruised knuckles, his face grim. "The kid had a grenade," he muttered incredulously. "He's nutty as a fruitcake. Imagine, a grenade!" Robson halted in his flight some 30 yards away and turned to face the two at the fence, shaking his fist and glaring at them with a malevolence that transformed the bruised, handsome face into a portrait of hideous rage. Ned looked at the bottom of the fence where it ran above the gully and saw the fairly large strip of cloth hanging from it like a limp banner. He stopped and pulled it free. Robson, becoming aware of the loss, twisted around for a few moments trying to see the extent of the damage, then he gave it up and felt around with his hands. The fingers he held up were stained red. He was bleeding, and the knowledge served only to intensify his rage. Furiously he shook his fist at Ned and Steve, his voice rising in a furious stream of obscenities. Then he pulled off his shirt and wrapped it around his waist like an apron that hung down his back and covered the damage. "I'll get you," he kept shouting all the while, practically foaming at the mouth. "I'll get you all if it's the last thing I do. I swear I'll get you." His voice rose into a wild cry of frustration, and he turned his back and raced away. "You coming in?" Ned shook his hand at the question. "Tell Andy and Nancy hello. My uncle won't let me go see them." "I'll do that. Thanks for whistling. Duke was having a hard time with that crazy kid. Don't forget, anytime you need, blow. That kid's going to make trouble. Watch out for him." "I will," Ned promised. "I will. Don't worry." "Somebody'd better worry," Steve replied grimly. "Imagine, a grenade!" Shaking his head in wonderment, the big man turned and climbed up the hill and out of sight. Ned stood watching until he disappeared. Then Ned headed for home. He was sure there was going to be more trouble with Owen about this. End of chapter 20. Much to Ned's surprise, Owen never brought up the latest run-in with Robson. Owen was at home, but he was too excited about the town meeting to worry about where Ned had been or what he'd done. He was on the phone busily calling everybody he knew and urging them to be present. Ned gathered that all the sons were doing the same thing, and even while he pictured the whole town busily at the phone, he heard a sound truck pass along the street, exhorting everybody in a loud mechanical voice to be present. It was clear that the Sons of the Vigilantes were the moving force behind the affair. Owen stopped calling, and then the phone started ringing as people called him. Ned sensed the tension in his uncle, and he knew it would be the same all over Hillstown. The town was on edge. Something big and exciting was brewing. He felt that a fuse was burning and rapidly approaching a keg of gunpowder. It made him feel strangely uneasy. Supper was a terrible strain. Owen kept getting up to answer the phone. Once or twice the doorbell rang, and Owen stepped out onto the porch and talked in excited tones. Once Kingsley called. Ned heard the sudden change in his uncle's voice, the respectful, almost oily sound Owen made when he spoke to Kingsley. He came back to the table and glared at Ned, but said nothing, merely asking Deborah brusquely to hurry with the coffee as he had important things to do. For a while Ned thought he might go. Then the phone rang for him. It was Miss Deeb, sounding quite abnormally excited. "I have a message from Mike for you, Ned," she told him breathlessly. "He said for you to stay away from this meeting." "He give any reason why?" Ned wanted to know. "No, he didn't. He was in such a hurry over the phone. But he did say he thought it would be very dangerous for you. He said to tell you to get over to All Saints and hear it over the radio. That would be the safest thing. He said I had to tell you because you aren't allowed to talk to him. Ned, I'm scared. Mike sounded terribly excited, and I couldn't get anything out of him except that it had something to do with Baldwin." "Thanks, Amanda," he said quietly. "Don't worry, I'll do just what you told me." He hung up and stood for a moment by the phone, wondering. The sense of impending danger was strong in him. "I'm going to church," he announced in a loud voice. "Be back later." And before Owen and Deborah could say anything, he was out in the street and running. The streets were surprisingly crowded. Little knots of men and women seemed to be everywhere, talking and gesticulating. An unusually large number of cars were in the streets. Tension was in the air. The town meeting, Ned thought, was really generating excitement. And then he stopped short, hearing the word "spaceship." For a moment he thought he'd imagined it, and then he realized, as he watched and listened, that the secret was out. Hillstown knew, now, what really was going on in the strange, mysterious regions beyond the fence. Walter was at the rectory, so was Amanda Deeb and the policeman Jerry Welch, who wore a faintly troubled frown. To Ned's delight, Father Carson was also there, looking expectant and not a bit worried. He welcomed Ned with a firm handclasp and a wide smile. "I have a message for you from Andy. He said to tell you Countdown is next week, and the invitation still goes. Nancy said to tell you, amen to that. Steve said, don't forget to whistle." He stopped and changed the subject. "I suppose you all know each other. Mike seems busy keeping down the size of the rally." He looked around at them and smiled. "Sit down, children. We have a long wait. Might as well be comfortable." Jerry Welch kept rubbing his hands together as if continually washing them, and his face kept looking more and more anxious. "Relax, Jerry," the priest said. "You're jumpier than a toad." "I don't like it, Father," the officer replied. "I don't like it at all. Kingsley's got every hothead in town on that platform, and he's got the regular cops scattered all over town. Something's brewing. Something nasty. Well, he's not normal. I wish Father Bolton hadn't gone." "Don't worry about Father Bolton," Father Carson said crisply. "He can take care of himself. Besides, Mike's with him, and we have a number of cool-headed people on the platform, too." He grinned. "Friend Kingsley's in for a surprise." "What do you mean?" "It is a serious tactical blunder to underestimate the adversary. It's also a mistake to overestimate your own strength. Old Forrest Sherlock, being, as you say, not normal, has made both mistakes, I think." He paused. "For one thing, there are a large number of people in this town who can't stand the Sons of the Vigilantes because of the way they've gone around insulting everybody. For another, there are many decent men in this town who regard the people you call 'hotheads' as simply crackpots. Mike and I and Father Bolton have been very busy all day rounding up these fine people and urging them to attend the town meeting. I imagine the disciples will be outnumbered 5 to 1. They make a lot of noise, but there aren't too many of them, thanks be to God." He looked at the policeman with a smile. "I think we've more or less pulled the rug out from under them." Father Carson refused to amplify, so they chatted about other things until it was time to tune in on the meeting. The first speaker was the mayor, who welcomed everybody in round, florid phrases and congratulated them on their devotion to their civic duty. He reminded them that this was a public meeting and said he expected them to behave in accordance with their firm democratic convictions about the right of free speech and free expression of opinion. He presented one by one the various distinguished personages on the platform, and then he got down to business and declared that the meeting was open. The first speaker was a man who needed no introduction. His distinguished fellow citizen and good friend, the temporary chief of police, Forrest Sherlock Kingsley. There was an expectant hush, punctuated by a few coughs, and then Kingsley launched into an impassioned oration. He was interested only in the peace and tranquillity of the community, to which end he had dedicated all his energies in a double trust. He expected soon to be able to announce the solution of the baffling and brutal crime which had made it incumbent upon him to assume the burdens of the heroic wounded man whom they all loved and respected, Mr. Drew. But there was something vastly more important. There was a terrible threat hanging over them all. He paused dramatically. "Here it comes," Father Carson chuckled. "Wait till he finds out we've spilled the beans." "In the Best compound," continued Kingsley in portentous tones, "instead of the relatively harmless research in silicates which they had all been led to believe was taking place, there was rising a monstrous engine whose existence threatened all their lives, not only because the engine itself was a hazard to the lives of everything for hundreds of miles, but because it represented a vicious and blasphemous effort to defy the eternal law of the Lord. They were building a spaceship!" He stopped again, expecting apparently consternation and pandemonium. Instead there was a faint murmur of surprise, disappointment, and incredulity. The shocking news had fallen flat. Kingsley swallowed audibly at the unexpected turn of events, then drew a deep breath and went on. "The Lord," he cried in solemn tones, "has taken pity on us His children and sowed the skies above our heads with twinkling beauty which may serve to raise our earthbound thoughts to Him in wonder and in gratitude. But it is not His purpose that we poor humans, debased and totally depraved as we are, should reach out with blasphemous fingers and sully the splendor of His handiwork. This spaceship is a blasphemy which we must not tolerate. We must destroy it. We must take our courage in our hands and overwhelm the hideous thing, blotting it out, drowning it, if need be, in torrents of blood." For a moment there was silence as the meaning of what he said sank in, and then there were loud cries of protest. "Mr. Mayor," Mike's powerful voice came clearly to the microphone. "Mr. Mayor, I have a couple of questions, please." "Excellent. Step up to the microphone, Mr. Pewkin." The mayor's voice had a note of grimness in it. "I am sure that as a teacher of science in our high school your questions will shed great light on this affair." "Thank you." Mike's voice sounded a trifle breathless, but it was strong and self assured. "I'd like to ask Mr. Kingsley a couple of questions, please." "Certainly," Kingsley replied unctuously. "You said that we were all children of the Lord," Mike said, "and while I might differ with you on the phrasing, I certainly agree with the idea." Kingsley laughed politely. "Now I'd like to ask you two questions, if I may. One, since men are children of the Lord and are made with the same care as the rest of His handiwork, how can we be sullying His handiwork by touching it? And secondly, if you're totally depraved, as you just said we all were, how can you in all honesty accept the job of enforcing the law?" He paused to let that sink in. "Personally, I don't think the Mayor or these nice people here, or even you, sir, are totally depraved." With that, pandemonium broke loose. There was laughter, then there were angry shouts and a babel of voices clamoring to be heard, and a vast confusion which gradually subsided as the mayor called for order. Kingsley tried again, but it wasn't any use. There had never, someone pointed out, been the slightest sound of trouble or the noise of explosions or anything even remotely resembling what they all knew took place at the rocket launchings in Cape Canaveral. The meeting went on, growing duller and duller as it progressed, until it dribbled away to nothing. "Good old Mike," Father Carson gloated. "Good old Father Bolton. I can just see them working up that bit about total depravity." "How about the other things?" Miss Deeb asked. "No problem, Amanda. The whole universe belongs to God. We'll never go anywhere He doesn't want us to go. All this stuff about intelligent life in other worlds is sheer conjecture. If there is life, He put it there. If there is intelligence, He gave it. If there is life and there is intelligence, there isn't much problem either. If either fell the way Adam did, or it passed the test and is unstained and unstainable, Christ is the firstborn of creatures and His merits are infinite. He's the King of the whole of creation. So you see, no matter how you look at it, Kingsley's wrong." "And there really is a spaceship?" Walter asked wide eyed. "Ned saw it. He was in it actually. Weren't you?" "I was," Ned agreed. "And I'm puzzled by a lot of things." The priest smiled. "Why don't you ask Mike about them tomorrow? He knows as much about it as anybody. In fact, Baldwin told me that it was a thesis Mike wrote on gyroscopics which gave him the idea for the whole ship. Now you'd better go. It'll be safe, I think, and I have a lot of work to do." They said their goodnights and walked out. Walter could hardly restrain his impatience. As they walked towards Ned's house, Ned described the ship to his friend and told him about Andy and Nancy. When he had finished, Walt looked wistful. "Do you think I could ever get to go on a trip like that?" he asked. "With my leg?" "Sure, Walt," Ned said encouragingly. "Sure you can. You just wait. We'll both go." They stopped and with one accord threw their heads back and stared at the wonder of the late spring sky. "We'll both make it. I'm sure we'll make it." End of chapter 21. IV. Owen came home drunk, his voice thick with anger and self-pity, long after the meeting had died of sheer inertia. It was clear that Kingsley had overestimated the power of his followers and badly underrated the opposition. He had tried to rouse the town to violence over the spaceship, and he had failed. The failure was bitter for Owen. Ned was awake in his bed looking at the stars, which twinkled faintly among the rustling leaves outside his window. His mind was filled with the memory of the pictures he had seen in the Santa Maria, the glorious spangled view of the stars from outside the atmosphere, the stunning vision he had recalled when Walt uttered his plaintive wish. He could go. They wanted him to go. He wondered for a moment what his father would have said, realizing that he couldn't even discuss the matter with his uncle. If Owen ever found out about the invitation. He could see the swift, gloating expression of triumph at realizing that he could refuse Ned something the boy wanted more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. "I'm not drunk." Owen's voice was loud and harsh as he angrily denied Deborah's scornful accusation. "And what if I were, lousy ingrates? So all right, I'm drunk. So what? Can't a man get drunk if he wants any more? It's your fault, that's what it is. All your fault. The whole stinking town's to blame. We'll show you. We're not licked yet. No, ma'am. Not me and Kingsley. We'll show you. We'll show the whole lousy town. That's what we'll do. You wait. You just wait." His voice choked, and a moment later he was sniffling loudly and complaining that nobody loved him. He was all alone. No matter how hard he tried, nothing ever came out right. Then he was angry again, violently inveighing against the foreigners, Best, the spaceship, Deborah, and the world in general, which was so callous and stupid as to reject him and Kingsley and poke fun at the Lord. Ned quietly slipped out of bed and silently locked the door. It wasn't a very good lock, he knew, but it would serve to keep Owen in his besotted condition out of the room. He had no desire to deal with his uncle under these circumstances. Next morning it was rainy and unpleasant. He went out to Mass through the French door earlier than usual, and came back the same way, feeling rather glad that he did so, when he heard Owen's plaintive voice in the living room complaining about a hangover to an unsympathetic Deborah. School was endless. Classes seemed to go on, without any sparkle of interest even in Mike's, which usually was fascinating. He realized slowly that he was tense as a coiled spring, and mentally blamed it on Owen for being drunk, then on the meeting yesterday, then on Kingsley, then on the announcement about the spaceship, and then, with candor, on the real reason. He wanted to go on the trip, and he wasn't going. Well, he thought, there'll be other trips. Sometime I'll go. Finally school was over, and he picked up his books and went home. Owen was there lying on the sofa, snoring softly. Deborah shook her head at him and warned him to be quiet with a finger to her lips. Owen reeked of liquor. So Ned put his books down silently and went out into the rainy afternoon, headed for the hospital. He felt a need to see a friendly face, to hear neutral talk, and Walter would probably be there visiting his father. Mr. Drew was sitting up in bed, looking shockingly thin and worn. It was clear that he had had a very close call, but he and Walt were both frankly glad to see him, and the time passed rapidly in friendly conversation. Mr. Drew was fascinated by the story of the spaceship and kept asking Ned pointed questions about it. How did it run? How did it steer? How big was it? How many could she carry? How long would the trip be? Ned answered as best he could, and Walt kept shaking his head in awe and wonder. "Sounds as if they thought of everything," Mr. Drew said admiringly. He did not seem to doubt that it would work. "What a world we're living in," he marveled softly. "Imagine, a trip to Mars, just like that. 83 million miles. I imagine it'll become a popular resort, too. It's just far enough away." "Would you let me go if I wanted to?" Walt asked, "seeing it's so safe?" "Depends, Walt." The sick man closed his eyes wearily. "Depends on what, Dad?" "Depends on how much you want it to go, I guess." He looked at his son, his eyes warm with affection. "A man shouldn't stand in the way of his son's ambitions unless they're bad." He sighed. "My father ran away to sea when he was young, and his father never forgave him for it. He was set on Dad being a lawyer, which my father hated. So when I asked Dad if I could join the Marines, he shook my hand and said yes, if that's what I really wanted. Just so I turned out to be the best Marine I could. We were really close, Pop and I. He taught me to learn for myself. He said a man has to decide what he wants to do with his life. That's the way God made us free. If you really want to become a spaceman, and you can do it, I just tell you what he told me. Go with God, son, and become the best spaceman you can. Now I'm tired. Maybe you ought to leave me alone for a while so I can get some sleep." They went out, silent, each busy with his own thoughts. His own father, Ned knew, would have said something along these lines. For a moment he felt envious of Walt because he had his father to talk to, and then he looked at the other's drawn face as he limped along beside him, and his heart felt warm with friendliness. It was still drizzling, and the late afternoon was gray and unpleasant, so that it seemed much later than 5. The streets were shiny and deserted. "Gosh," Walt muttered, turning up the collar of his jacket. "What a dreary day. You don't have to come with me, Ned. Why don't you run ahead and get out of this?" "I don't mind," Ned said, breathing deeply. "I like to walk in the rain. Let's go look at the hole in the fence." Walt took that up eagerly, and they moved along more briskly. Behind them, unnoticed by either boy, Robson Kingsley riding a bicycle turned a corner and slid to a stop where he saw them. For a few moments he watched them in silence, noting the direction in which they were headed. Then, with a sudden look of satisfaction on his handsome face, he turned his bicycle silently and sped away down a cross street, his strong legs pumping furiously on the pedals. They reached the hole and stood there under the bright green sign that forbade entry, and stared through the fence at the muddy hills beyond. "It's down that way," Ned pointed in the general direction of the concealed hangar. "About 3-4 minutes by jeep." He shook his head. So near, so far, so infinitely far. Suddenly, to his amazement, Andy Baldwin was standing at the top of the hill. When he saw Ned, his face brightened with that swift, flashing smile, and he slid adroitly down to where they stood. "This is a break," he said happily. "I pumped Father Carson about where your house was, and I was going to sneak in and see you." His eyes were dancing with excitement. "We're taking off tomorrow night." He seemed to notice Walt for the first time. "Hi," he said. "I'm Andy Baldwin. I suppose he's told you." "He's told me," Walt nodded. "And I'm glad to know you." "Any chance of your coming?" Andy asked Ned. Ned shook his head, slowly, regretfully. "That's tough." Andy looked disappointed, then cheered up. "But there's still time. Maybe you can work something out tomorrow. Any time up till 8 tomorrow night, Ned, and you can still make it. Maybe I can get Steve to kidnap you." "My uncle says I'm not to go inside the Best compound for any reason," Ned replied. "Oh, that bad, is it?" He shook his head sympathetically and then looked at his watch. "Ooh, better be heading back. Be seeing you." He turned and started running up the hill. Near the top his feet suddenly slipped out from under him. He twisted, lost his footing, and went tumbling head over heels into the gully, where he struggled to a sitting position, his face twisted with pain. "Hurt?" Ned asked anxiously. "I don't know. My left foot's stuck. Wow, it feels like it's broken." "I'll be right with you." Without a moment's hesitation Ned flung himself into the hole and crawled through. Owen, he thought, wouldn't expect him not to help an injured boy. He didn't hear Walt say he was going to call someone to help, failed to see the crippled boy go rushing into the rain and disappear in the direction of the nearest house, more than a block away. Andy's foot was wedged in between 2 rocks and he couldn't move it. Ned tried to pull the stones away, digging furiously with his hands, trying to loosen it. They were slippery with clay and he couldn't budge it. Andy tried to help, but he was in an awkward position and couldn't reach his foot. "Untie the laces. Maybe I can slip my foot out." But the laces were muddy and the knot had slipped so that Ned's cold fingers were unavailing. He searched his pockets for a knife and his fingers touched the porcelain whistle. The silent blast made both their ears ring. "I've lost mine," Andy said apologetically. "Must be around here somewhere." His face was white with pain. "I must have sprained my ankle," he said disgustedly. "Good old mountain goat, Andy Baldwin." Ned kept trying, futilely, to budge the rocks. And he was still trying when the huge figure of Steve hove into view. The giant took the situation with one swift look, and in a trice was kneeling beside Andy's captive foot, a tiny penknife glittering in his strong fingers. In a moment the lace was cut, and then with a swift, careful move and a warning, "This'll hurt," he gently disengaged Andy's foot, stripped off the sock and felt it with his fingers. "Just a sprain," he said. "I hope. Nice going, Ned. Thanks." With a fluid, easy motion he had Andy in his arms and was carefully making his way up the slippery hill, leaving Ned standing beside the abandoned shoe, staring after them. When they disappeared, he slid down into the gully and pulled himself through the hole under the fence. A strong hand grasped his shoulder, jerked him to his feet, and before he could lift a finger something struck him in the chest and hurled him back against the fence with stunning force. An instant later a second blow, high on the side of his head, numbed him. His eyesight blurred and he shook his head to clear it, only to receive a third blow on the jaw which took all the strength out of his knees and made him feel limp as a rag. Dimly he saw his Uncle Owen's face only a few inches from his own, glaring at him with bloodshot eyes, and he felt his hot breath on his face, rancid with drink. Owen's mouth was working, and as from a great distance Ned heard his words. "I told you never to go in there, didn't I? This is the way you obey your guardian. I'll show you. I'll teach you." There were others there, familiar figures. He tried furiously to think who they were, and finally succeeded. The Kingsleys. The smell of drink was strong. All three of them, he thought, are drunk. If only he could move. If only he could lift his hands to strike back at their faces. "Not here," he heard a faraway voice. "In the barn." "Yeah," Owen leered. "In the barn. That's the place." Ned tried to resist, but in their hands he was completely helpless. His knees were like rubber. He couldn't think. He was aware of the rain on his face and breathed deeply. Slowly his mind cleared. Slowly strength flowed back into his wobbly legs. He tried to struggle free, but they held him firm. He tried to resist, and they dragged him. He tried to shout, and a strong hand covered his mouth. When they reached the barn they threw him in bodily. He landed in a heap. He heard the sound of the door closing and saw the naked bulbs spring to life. They towered over him, two grown men and a boy as big and strong as either, their faces filled with hatred, their breath reeking of drink. "Now," Owen said, removing his coat. "Now I'll show you." End of chapter 22. Far away, urgently, someone was calling him. Ned heard the sound clearly through the roaring red black mist that surrounded him. It was faint and distant, but he knew he had to answer it. He had to. Desperately he struggled through the redness toward the sound, impelled by the urgency of it. His feet were lead, his breath was a hot agony in his body, but he had to keep trying. Suddenly the red mist dissipated, and there was coolness on his face, light in his eyes. He saw Deborah and Mike and Walt, their anxious faces floating above him, far away, then suddenly sharp and clear and close. The pain washed over him then, like a wave, and in spite of himself he moaned. His mouth had an acrid salt taste in it, familiar and nauseating. Walt's face wore horror on it. He looked as if he were about to be sick. Deborah's face was tear-stained. Mike looked as if carved out of granite. "I'm not supposed to speak to you," Ned muttered, and Walt's face wavered, tears suddenly running down it. "Easy, boy." Mike's voice came from a great distance. "Easy does it." He was aware then that the pain was not one big wave. It was 100, 1,000 separate and distinct pains, each one throbbing with its own individual hurt. He closed his eyes and opened them again, trying to understand, trying to remember. Owen. "The barn?" he asked, forcing his voice thickly through his throat. He was aware of other things then. The taste in his mouth was blood. His shirt was gone. There was a great rent in his trousers. "Help me up," he said. Relief flooded their faces for a moment, washed away the horror and the anger and the anxiety. Their hands were gentle. "What a beating," he heard Walt say. "They're insane," Mike said crisply. "They must be." The room reeled as Ned sat up, steadied, reeled again. Mike put an arm under his shoulder and lifted him to his feet. "We've got to get him to the house," Deborah said. "No," Mike replied. "They'll be back, and that's the first place they'll look. We can't take chances. They're crazy. We'll go to Amanda's. They won't think of looking there. Can you walk, Ned?" Ned tried, stumbled. Mike's strong arm held him up. The world began to spin dizzily about him again. He felt himself slipping down a long black incline and scrabbled furiously back to the light. He was aware that he was moving, not walking, but bouncing gently, his head on Mike's shoulder, his arm around Mike's neck. He felt the rain on his face, on his arms and shoulders. It was cold and pleasant and soothing. He heard dimly the sound of the car starting and felt the wind on his face as lights whirled past. Then he was on a bed, and deft, gentle hands were on him, hurting, but somehow soothing, and he let the darkness swallow him up. The pain awakened him, pain in his side, burning pain along his back. He opened his eyes. Mike was still there beside him, and he remembered then, in a flash, what had happened. "They were too much for me," he said to Mike. "They were too strong." He coughed. "I hurt. It was pretty bad, Mike. It was awful." He paused. "Was I out long?" "Not long." Mike shook his head. "Walt saw them drag you into the barn, so he rushed up to Deborah's and called me. My car took a while to start, and when I got there they were gone. Walt says they ran away half a minute before I came, saying something about being afraid you were dead. You'll be all right, though. Can you sit up?" Ned sat up stiffly. The room stayed put. "Walt's out getting you something to wear," Mike said, sitting on the edge of the bed and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your clothes are a mess, what was left of them. Torn and filthy. You must have put up quite a scrap." "Didn't do much good." Ned shuddered. "They were too much. Rob got my shirt. It wasn't fair. They kicked when I was down. Owen's strap was the worst. I didn't know they made pain like that. I blacked out, I think." "Don't wonder. Your back's a mess. Nothing broken though, thank God. I don't think there'll be any scars either. How do you feel?" "One big ache with a lot of little aches on top of it." Mike smiled at him. "Turn over. I have some stuff here I want to rub on your back. It'll sting a little at first, but it's good for you. You can scream if you like. You're entitled to it." "I don't think I screamed," Ned said. "I remember swearing I wouldn't. Ouch, take it easy. That's sore." "Sorry. Feel better?" "Nice and cool." Walter came in with a bundle: dungarees, a soft windbreaker jacket, a pair of shower slippers. His face was white, his eyes danced with excitement. "Listen," he said. "Hear that?" They strained their ears. From outside, faintly, they heard the sound of sirens, of loud voices. Amanda Deeb and Deborah came into the room, alarm on their faces. Mike flung open the window and the sound was much clearer. It was 2 or 3 blocks away, they judged. "The Sons of Vigilantes," Walt said, his voice shaking with excitement. "Kingsley sent out a call. They're getting the whole crowd together." "What on earth for?" Amanda asked. "I heard a couple of them talking. Kingsley said Bess kidnapped you, Ned. He's going to swear all the Sons in as special police, and they're going out to rescue you. He's already sent out a call for a bulldozer to knock down the fence. He's going to give them all guns, and they swear they're going to rescue you even if they have to blow up the compound to do it and shoot everybody in it." "But that's silly," Deborah said. "Ned's here." "You've got to stop them, Mike," Ned said. "Somebody's liable to be killed." "Can't do a thing about it," Mike said slowly. "Kingsley's set on raiding Bess. If we show them you're safe, he'll spring something else, like having proof that the Bess people robbed the bank and shot Mr. Drew." "Kingsley's got a white whistle he says the kidnappers dropped when they snatched you," Walt put in. "The guys I heard said there was no doubt about it." "Well, we'll have to warn them," Ned said. "How? You know their phone number?" Ned shook his head. "Maybe Father Bolton does," Walt suggested. "He must have been able to talk with Father Carson when he was in the compound." Mike picked up the phone, listened a moment, and then hung up. "Too late. There's a man asking for a number, please. Means Kingsley won't let anyone phone Bess, even if we know the number. Can you walk?" "I can try," Ned said. "Okay. You girls get out of here and let him dress. Only one thing to do. We'll have to drive down to the gate." "Well, that's 20 miles," Walt objected. "By that time they'll know." "Any other ideas?" Mike asked. "Let's drive out to the church," Ned suggested. "Father Bolton may think of something, and anyway, if he doesn't, we'll be too late." He was dressed now, the clothing a new pain to his bruised body. He took a few tentative steps. He was stiff and it hurt in 100 different ways and places, but he managed it and then turned to Mike with what he hoped was a smile. "What about Debbie and Amanda?" he asked. The noise was louder now. There were voices raised in furious shouts. Kingsley was stirring up his followers into a frenzy. "They'll have to stay here," Mike decided. "It's risky outside." But the girls had other ideas. "It's risky here, too," Amanda said, her freckles standing out vividly against her pale face, her voice unexpectedly firm. "Besides, a woman's place is by her man. Do you think I'm going to let you go out and get yourself shot or something while I wait around wringing my hands? Nothing doing. I go." "I'm going too," Deborah announced. "You can leave me at the church. They won't look for me there." She was pale. Owen wouldn't think of that. "All right," Mike shrugged. "Let's go. I only hope the car starts this time. Give Ned a hand, Walt." Walt nodded and put his arm gently around Ned's waist, while Ned put his arm around the other's shoulder and winced a little at the firm grip on his waist. There was no point in arguing. He could walk after a fashion, but his knees were rubbery and it was comforting to feel Walt's solid strength. Walt's right leg was withered and he walked with a limp, but he suddenly seemed sturdy as an oak. He turned his face and smiled at Ned. "Lean on me, Brain," he said softly. "That's what friends are for." End of chapter 23. Two. The rectory was a haven of peace. Not a sound of tumult here, not a bit of confusion. Father Bolton opened the door, and his face became suddenly a mirror of concern as he saw Ned. "Good heavens, son!" he exclaimed aghast. "What happened to you?" "It's a long story, Father," Mike replied briskly. "We don't have time for it now. Can you get in touch with the Best compound?" "I think so. What's wrong?" "The Sons are going to raid it. They have guns." "Great Scott! Wait, Father Carson will want to hear about this." He pushed a button on his desk. "He's here?" "Indeed he is. He came back to pick up some calculations he needed. Here he is now." "Thank God," Ned whispered, feeling faint. "Thank God." Father Carson entered, looked puzzled, then alarmed as he saw Ned's face. Crisply, before the priest could ask any questions, Mike told him about the impending raid. "Can you warn them?" "Not from here." The lame priest shook his head. "How much time do we have? An hour?" "Less, I think. Half an hour. 45 minutes at most," Mike said grimly. "Ferd Smythe has a bulldozer in his second section. It'll take them 10 minutes over there. 25, 30 minutes back to the fence." "All right," the priest said. "Get out to the garage and get my jeep going. I'll be back in a minute. Get everybody aboard who's coming." He vanished into his room. Deborah looked at Ned. "You've been a good son. Now don't worry." Gently she kissed him. "Now you'd better get going." The jeep horn sounded outside. Stiffly Ned clambered into the back seat and sat in the middle, while Walt and Amanda piled in on either side of him. Walt's brace struck Ned's leg on a bruise and he winced. The rain had stopped, but the night was overcast and damp. It felt as if it would rain again any moment. Mike sat at the wheel, his hands tense. Inside, through the open door, they could see Father Carson with a briefcase under his arm, talking to Father Bolton, who raised his hand in blessing, nodded, and shook the younger man's hand firmly. "Shove over." Father Carson climbed into the driver's seat. "There is no time to give instructions. Ned?" "Yes, Father." "Take these and guard them with your life. No matter what happens, they have to get on the ship. Is that clear? Don't let anything stop you from getting them aboard. Not anything." He tossed something at Walt. "You blow that thing. Short blast. 3, 2, 1. Wait 5. 3, 2, 1. Don't stop. Now hang on. This is going to be bumpy." With a jerk the jeep started out. Ned clung to the briefcase. Beside him, the soundless vibrations of the whistle set his teeth on edge. Somewhere, he knew, those vibrations were being translated into a howling siren, and a light on a map was moving along, pinpointing the source of that banshee wailing. The jeep raced along a road, turned off, jounced along a gully, climbed up a steep bank, and rattled desperately through a field of stubble, crossed a creek with a mighty splash, and was suddenly on Route 87, racing furiously along toward Dumas. Suddenly the brakes screeched, the priest turned the wheel, and they were bouncing along a field towards a cluster of lights in the distance. The fence appeared in the headlights, looming larger and larger as they approached. The priest turned left and drove along the fence for 500 yards before he jammed his fist on the horn and said jubilantly, "Thank God, there it is." He slowed to a stop. In the fence there was a narrow opening large enough for a man. Beyond it, in the light of the jeep's headlights, something loomed. "Chaplain's private entrance," Father Carson said, leaping down with astonishing agility. "Come on." They came. Every step was agony. Ned clung to the briefcase grimly with one hand, hanging on to Walt with the other. Beyond the fence was one of the Rollagon engines, its motor roaring. The driver was standing beside it, and Ned recognized him with a sense of unreality. He had, months before, driven the first best machine Ned had seen. His face had been expressionless then, disinterested. Now there was anxiety on it. "No time to talk," Father Carson panted. "Help us get in and make tracks for the base. Hurry." The driver helped them in, swinging Amanda and Walt up into the body of the machine with effortless ease. He was reaching for Ned when he stopped and drew his breath sharply. "Holy cow," he said quietly. "You poor kid." His hands were gentle as he picked Ned up like a child and placed him carefully inside the huge machine. "Stand up and hang on to that pipe, kid," he advised. "You'll ride easier that way." Ned felt sick. He must be an awful sight. Grimly he hung onto the briefcase with one hand and clung to the pipe with the other. The motor roared and the machine started moving. It was a strange ride. The huge, soft rollers absorbed the bumps, but the machine swayed and rocked like a small boat in a rough sea. Walt and Amanda hung grimly onto the pipe too, and Ned felt Walter trying to say something which he could not hear above the roaring of the engine. He felt himself getting weak, and then suddenly the nightmare ride came to an end. There was a bright light, and the huge figure of Steve leaped easily into the truck. "So you made it, kid?" He heard the big man's voice through a loud roaring, and saw the sudden concern in Steve's face as it began to waver and grow uncertain around the edges. He felt suddenly that nothing mattered any more. He was aware of Walt's sudden yelp of alarm, and he slid soundlessly into a warm, soft pool of blackness that sustained him like a strong man's arms. End of chapter 24. Lights flickered faintly. There were soft tinkling sounds. Coolness, spicy and fragrant, with the scent of seawater and pine trees, soothed his brow, spread rapidly and deliciously over his whole being, flowed down his arms and back, around his chest and stomach, and down the length of his legs to his feet, causing a faintly tingling sensation. He felt himself floating on an aromatic cloud which held him up with infinite gentleness, cradling his body tenderly, caressing it silkily with countless gossamer fingers that eased and soothed and relaxed, rubbing away pain. He stretched lazily, wiggled his toes luxuriously, and opened his eyes. Andy was looking down at him, his face wearing an unaccustomed look of anxiety, which vanished suddenly in the strange inner radiance of his smile. "Hi," he grinned. "Feeling better?" Ned nodded, foggily, puzzled by the presence of the other while the sensation of floating on a cloud still wrapped him around. "You real?" he asked. Andy laughed gently, and his hand touched Ned's forehead, firm and warm. He became aware of other things then. The sound of voices, of people moving around. Andy looked over his shoulder and moved to one side. His place was taken by a little man with strange glasses that made his eyes look like rainbows. What was his name? Bliss, that was it. Dr. Bliss. He had a little glass in his hand and he smiled reassuringly. "Here." His voice was still astonishing. Even his whisper boomed. "Drink this." He put a gentle hand behind Ned's neck, lifted his head, and put the vessel to his lips. It was syrupy and faintly sweet, with a tart, pleasant flavor. Ned swallowed it, and his mouth felt fresh and clean with a delicious tingling cleanness. "You'll be all right." The doctor's voice was friendly, reassuring. "Just stay where you are a little while longer." He was gone, and Andy was looking at him again. "Where am I?" Ned asked. "In my room," Andy told him. "On my bed. You feel better?" Ned thought that over. He still ached, but the pains were remote, somehow, dulled as if far away, and he still felt the strange sensation of floating on a cloud. "I feel like I'm floating," he said. "You are," Andy grinned. "You are, in Bankite. I told you about it once." "Okay," Ned replied. "Have it your way. I'm floating." He raised his hands and looked at them, trying to remember something. With a sudden, sinking feeling he recalled what it was. "That package!" he cried. "The briefcase!" "Easy, boy," Andy reassured him. "Father Carson has it. He's working with it on the ship." He grinned. "You fainted dead away, but you hung on to that thing like grim death. We had to pry it loose, finger by finger." Ned tried to smile and felt his swollen lips begin to split. Andy's face was grave and his smile concerned. "Doc says your face will look like a rainbow for a few days, but nothing's busted. Somebody really worked you over. You should have heard Steve." He shook his head admiringly at the recollection. Steam was coming out of his ears. Whoever it was had better not bump into him. That struck a chord. "They're coming," Ned said in sudden alarm. "They're going to shoot everybody and wreck the ship." "Easy, boy, easy. We know. Walt and what's-his-name Mike told us. We're handling it." "I've got to help," Ned declared positively. "I've got to. We can't let them. "Take it easy, son." Mr. Baldwin's quiet voice came from somewhere. "Everything's under control. I've got guards out, and the others are loading and checking. Just a couple of hours, that's all. We can hold 'em off that long." The phone rang, a subdued, discreet sound, and Ned lifted his head and saw Mr. Baldwin at the desk, the white telephone in his hand. "That's right, Duke," he said. "Take all the cars and put them in a big half circle about half a mile out. Leave the motors racing and the lights on high beam, so they'll have to go way out to keep in the dark." He listened. "No, leave them and come back as fast as you can. They're expendable, the men aren't." He listened again and made small agreeing sounds several times, then shook his head. "No, just one machine gun on top of the hangar. And tell Wright to shoot high. I don't want any blood spilled. They're crazy, but they're still people. I don't want this trip to cost lives. Right. That's right. Get them all back to the hangar. We need them for the countdown." He hung up and came over to Ned. "Can you get up, do you think?" Ned nodded. "All right, then. Get dressed and go with Andy. You don't have to move around much. All you'll have to do is read checklists, both of you. That'll free a couple of able-bodied people for other things." He smiled. "I take it you're not going back to Hillstown?" "Not if I can help it," Ned said grimly. "Not after this." "Okay. Andy, get him some clothes." Ned tried to sit up and found himself sinking. For a moment he was frantic, and then he was on something solid. Astonished, he looked for the first time down at himself and found that he was sitting in what looked like a bathtub full of clear blue liquid. But it didn't feel like liquid. It felt like silken feathers, resilient and dry. Fascinated, he scooped a handful and looked at it. It was blue and flowed around in his hand, its surface shiny. He spilled it and it splashed, but it left his hand completely dry. He remembered once, in chemistry lab, holding a little mercury in his hand. It had behaved exactly the same way, except that it had been much heavier. Stiffly he stood up, and the liquid swirled and eddied with his motion but did not cling to him. It was totally indifferent to his presence. He saw then that Andy's left foot was swathed heavily in bandages and that he was using a crutch. Andy tossed the cellophane wrapped packages on top of the swirling liquid. They floated. "Makes a swell bed," Andy said. "I usually keep a cloth on it so I won't bury my face in the stuff or splash it all over the floor. I'm a restless sleeper. Doc insisted it has medicinal qualities and put you in it. Feel better?" "Feel fine." Ned was opening the packages, struggling into the clothes. A skin-tight suit of some heavy netting, a one-piece coverall with a broad, soft leather belt, and comfortable shoes with thick, flexible soles that laced halfway up his calves. "Okay? How do we get to the ship?" "I drive you," Mr. Baldwin said quietly. "You got everything?" Andy looked around, then pointed to the carved St. Andrew above his strange bed. His father nodded, and without a word he took it down and handed it to his son. "Let's go." Ned was glad that Andy's hobbling progress with his crutch made them move slowly. His body still throbbed stiffly, and it would have been painful for him to move rapidly. They went down the corridors and out into the open night, where a jeep stood waiting. The rain had begun again, and from somewhere, far off, there came the sound of a single rifle shot. End of chapter 25. Zero. Ned sat on a padded stool at a small table that folded down from the wall, reading the items on a long list aloud into a small microphone. He made a small mark before each as a voice replied from the tiny speaker. "Cabin 3, ventilator open. Check. Water. Check. Kit A. Check. 6 O tanks. Check." Distantly, a metallic voice, totally devoid of emotion, said, "42 minutes. Rifles and ammo. Check. Parachute packs A, B, and C. Check. Pressure suit type Y. Check." In other places there were similar checks being made. Andy had a list. Walter and Nancy each had one too. Men moved along the corridors carrying bundles. Machinery hummed. Urgent voices shouted for someone to hurry up with those emergency rations for the auxiliary control room. The great ship hummed with swift orderly activity. 34 minutes, said the dispassionate metallic voice. The list was incredibly long, but finally there were the last 3 items. 6-cell flashlights and clips. Check. Oxygen renewal tanks T, R, and K. Check. Clothing kit number 18. Check. All out. 12 minutes, said the voice. Then another equally metallic. Duke Higgins, Duke Higgins. Report to Captain in control room. 10 minutes. Fasten seatbelts, please. Smoking lamp is out. Ned Bartley to the control room on the double. Door crew prepared to open hangar gate. Andy hobbled past. "How do I get to the control room from here?" Ned demanded. "Follow me." 9 minutes. Engines report. Number 9 and 10 ready. Number 5 and 6 ready. Case of chocolate bars missing in C20. Hurry it up. Duke Higgins, get the lead out of your feet and report to the captain on the double. 8 minutes. Open hangar doors. The control room was crowded and confused. There was a man on the floor, and Amanda was kneeling beside him. Baldwin, his face grim, spoke into a microphone. "Stop the countdown. Dr. Bliss, please, to the control room." "What happened?" Ned asked. "That's Josh Krieg," Andy told him. "The navigator. He's been shot. Ricochet from the steam shovel while he was coming back with some calculations he thought he needed." "What happens now?" Andy shrugged. "We don't go unless Father Carson changes his mind. We can't take a chance of taking off with only Dad and Duke Higgins to do the aiming. Mars is awfully far away." "Dad!" Nancy's voice was shrill with excitement. "Look!" They all looked. The hangar doors had opened and lights had come to life along the landing strip. Several hundred yards away they saw two men overturn a barrel, and suddenly the roadway was blazing as the spilled gasoline was ignited. In the glare of the flame they could see a wildly gesticulating figure brandishing a rifle. "It's Kingsley," Mike said dully. "Look at him. He's completely berserk." "All right." Father Carson's voice was quiet. "I'll go. That does it." "Resume countdown," the metallic voice said. 8 minutes. "Sit here by me," Mike's voice called Amanda up from her knees to his side, "and strap down tight. You can read these numbers for me." "Go help Father Carson," Baldwin said to Ned. "Andy, you come here. Nancy, read for Doc. How is Krieg?" "He'll live," the big voice boomed. "He'll live. Get that big brute to bed him down somewhere. Where is Higgins?" "Right here." Higgins appeared suddenly at the door, his hair in wild disarray, a streak of oil staining one cheek. "Take the controls, Duke," Baldwin said. "You're taking her up. Father?" "All set. Just one more row." 6 minutes. "Here we go." Ned continued to read the figures to Father Carson, who punched buttons in some sort of calculator before him. There was a sudden stillness in the room. Ned became aware suddenly of a slight vibration in the floor. It smoothed out, was joined by other vibrations. 4 minutes. Something pinged loudly above their heads. A line of men were standing beyond the smoking barrier of flame, the flickering light shining on the barrels of their rifles. "They're shooting at us!" Ned heard Amanda's incredulous voice. "They're trying to kill us!" "Don't worry, honey." Mike's smile was reassuring. "It would take a cannon to dent this baby." 30 seconds, the mechanical voice said, still level and unemotional. Father Carson pushed the last button and smiled as the little computer went into a perfect frenzy of clickings, finally disgorging a strip of paper with figures on it. "Check," he said. Then he reached out for a microphone and held it to his lips. "In the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity." Ned knew the solemn words were echoing in every corner of the great ship. "We humbly beg for a swift journey and a safe return. Prosidamus in pace. In peace may we start out, in peace travel, in peace conclude our journey, to the glory of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." Ned heard fervent amens breathed around him. 15 seconds. The vibrations were different, like the soundless shrilling of the porcelain whistles, but vastly deeper, infinitely more powerful. Slowly the ship lurched forward. 10 seconds. The voice was not quite so detached now. Outside, the figures behind the fire moved uneasily back, lowering their guns as they realized that the ship was coming toward them, and realized for the first time the awesome size of it. Kingsley was still dancing around in the center of the paved strip, furiously brandishing his rifle and apparently screaming at his men to shoot, to stop it, somehow, anyhow. Robson, beside him, his face wearing a look of terror, tugged at his father's arm and was flung aside roughly. He staggered, lost his balance, and fell into the wavering wall of flame. A second later he was on his feet, rushing madly in a circle, his clothing on fire, his mouth open in what must have been a terrible scream. Kingsley dropped his gun, tripped him, rolled him over the ground, and tried futilely to beat out the flames. Robson writhed and struggled in agony and suddenly lay still. Ned saw Kingsley cradle the boy in his arms, rocking back and forth, and he knew that Kingsley would never again see anything except the sight of his son in flames. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The voice was suddenly a cry of triumph. Ned felt himself pressed back against his seat, saw the ribbon of fire racing under him, the road rushing out of the darkness toward him in a blur of speed, and suddenly they were aloft, climbing. He felt the slow tilt into a smooth, ascending bank, and saw the clouds scud by, part and vanish. Ahead lay the bright splendor of the stars. The beginning. End of chapter 26. End of Countdown by Becker, S.J.